Hey there, dear fellow travellers of the night. Before we begin our gentle voyage through the mist-laced moors and time-worn castles of medieval Scotland, there's a small request to share. In the comment section below, it would be lovely to hear where listeners are joining from, and what hour the clock reads in their corner of the world. Whether some are winding down in London, just waking up in Sydney, or floating somewhere in between, it warms the heart to have them along. And if these gentle rambles into distant centuries bring comfort, we invite them to subscribe so that each new tale finds its way to their bedside. Now, as they settle into the quiet of the evening, allow the mind to meander to a land both breathtaking and unforgiving. A land where the soft call of bagpipes rolls through glens, and the sharp ring of claymores echoes among the crags. The Scotland known today, with its welcoming people, firelit pubs, and spellbinding scenery, rests upon a foundation forged in hardship and unrest. Though modern tales might weave images of noble knights and joyous bands of men, the truth for Scots across those medieval centuries was far more severe. Clan rivalries erupted into conflict, English forces advanced, the church's authority loomed large, and hunger and disease lingered as constant shadows. For most, life was neither long nor easy, whether tending to crops as humble peasants or drawn into the web of lords, chiefs, and crown. Their days were defined by survival. Over the course of this quiet journey, perhaps as sleep gently arrives, we'll begin to lift the veil of myth and melody. Beneath it, a more rugged truth waits, of how they lived, loved, and endured in a world in turmoil. Along the way we'll meet fierce Highland fighters, deeply devout queens, and the many ordinary souls who worked the land, dreaming of something more. But first let the setting unfold. Picture a wild, unyielding terrain where silvery mist clings to still lochs, and heather waves in the wind's quiet breath. The Highland mountains stand tall like ancient sentinels, their summits hidden in swirling clouds, while the glens below are traced by streams rushing cold and clear. In the lowlands, gentle slopes stretch into fields ripe with barley and oats, where cottages gather round modest stone kirks. The breeze carries the scent of peat smoke and damp pine, drifting through forests thick with Scots pine and ancient oak, where red deer hide and boars forage below. Above, golden eagles glide across the open sky, their calls sharp and distant. When night arrives, the stars burn bright and unfiltered by city lights, spilling across the heavens like quiet fire. But despite this awe-inspiring beauty, peril was never far away. Clans held grudges passed down generations, preparing ambushes beneath the moonlight. Nobles manoeuvred for power and land with whispered alliances, and from the south the English threat cast a long shadow. For the people who lived beneath this vast sky, each day brought new challenges, facing weather, war, and want with quiet resolve. Amidst the weight of disease and the unpredictable will of those who ruled over them, they found comfort in the steady rhythms of the seasons, the closeness of kin and clan, and the teachings carried by the church. This was the setting in which their story quietly took root, a story woven with endurance, devotion, and the steadfast soul of a people who, across long centuries of difficulty, would shape a nation of their own. As we make our way through these uneasy times, we shall meet both monarchs and labourers, saints and scoundrels, champions and foes, all threads in the grand tapestry of Scotland's past. Yet for now, let the voices of history grow soft, fading gently as they ease into sleep. Imagine the leaves whispering in the woodlands, the soft lowing of cattle grazing in distant pastures, and the faint melody of a minstrel's lute carried on the wind. Let these sounds become their lullaby as the night deepens, and we prepare to venture gently into the very soul of medieval Scotland. Rest well, weary souls, for when tomorrow arrives, our tale shall begin in full. In those early days, Scotland was no single, united land, but rather a patchwork quilt stitched together by fiercely autonomous clans. Each stood proudly behind its kin, ever ready to defend its name or seize new lands from those nearby. The clan formed the very spine of their society, offering belonging, identity, and protection in a realm where the king's justice reached few and seldom. At the helm of each clan was the chief, a man both respected and feared, embodying a blend of warrior, judge, and patriarch. His duty was to watch over his people, to guide them, protect them, and lead them into conflict if need arose. whether against neighbours or outside invaders. In this fractured world, loyalty to one's own clan outweighed any vow to a distant monarch. With the crown's influence often fragile or hotly contested, it was kinship that truly bound communities together. A man's promise held sacred weight, and to go back on a vow or betray his clan meant disgrace, exile, or even death. Yet, as strong as that bond was, it cast deep shadows too. For clan loyalty, unwavering as it was, could also spark endless cycles of revenge and retribution, spiralling across generations. A mere insult to a clan's dignity, a cattle raid, or a land dispute might ignite a bloody feud that neither side would soon forget. One of the most infamous and bitter of such feuds erupted between the Campbells and the MacDonalds, two of the Highlands' mightiest clans. For generations, these families battled over territory, wealth, and dominance, with their mutual contempt passed down like a cursed inheritance. The roots of their enmity stretch back to the early 1300s, when Robert the Bruce rewarded the Campbells with lands in Argyll, recognising their loyalty during the Wars for Independence. But the MacDonalds, who had long held claim to those same lands, viewed this as a grave betrayal, a violation of ancestral right. What began as resentment soon evolved into war. For years, both clans waged raids on each other, torching homes, stealing herds, and striking down foes without mercy. But the most chilling moment came in 1646, when, under orders from the Scottish government, Campbell soldiers slaughtered dozens of MacDonald men, women and children as they lay sleeping in their homes in Glencoe. This dark event, remembered as the Glencoe Massacre, would forever mark the Campbells with disgrace and give the MacDonalds a lasting cry for vengeance. That act not only hardened the hatred between the clans, but also revealed how outside powers, in this case the English crown, had learned to exploit old rivalries to suppress the Highlands, using clan against clan. For the ordinary folk tangled in these age-old grudges, life became a test of endurance. At any moment their homes could be overrun by enemy clans, their harvests destroyed, their livestock seized, and their families left in mourning. They lived each day with the weight of uncertainty, knowing that peace could vanish with the beat of a horse's hooves or the glint of steel on a neighbour's ridge. Reprisals remained a constant fear, as none could ever be sure when they might be summoned to defend their clan's reputation with blade in hand. And still, in the shadow of such relentless tension, the clan system offered something deeply anchoring. A shared identity, a feeling of place, of belonging. In a world so fragile, being part of a clan meant knowing there were those who would stand by them, who would fight for them, and whose lineage stretched far into the mists of time. As we shall come to understand, this powerful sense of loyalty would carve lasting marks upon the path of Scottish history, at once feeding the flames of endless conflict and giving strength to a people who would survive through centuries of hardship. Yet the story of survival did not belong to warriors and clan leaders alone. Most who lived and died in medieval Scotland were not nobles, but ordinary souls, peasants, labourers and tradespeople, who formed the true foundation of society. For them, life was a daily contest with poverty, sickness, and suppression. As soon as a child could stand steadily on their feet, they were sent into the fields, tending to crops and livestock from the first light of day until the final glow of dusk. Early in life, they came to know that their fate was to work endlessly for the benefit of their lords, with little to no chance of breaking free from the role they had been born into. As the years passed, their burdens grew heavier. Men toiled through long days, driving ploughs, watching over sheep, and cutting peat from the earth to burn for heat, their backs bowed and limbs worn from years of gruelling effort. Women bore no lighter burden. Alongside their husbands, they worked the land, all while raising children, often pregnant or nursing infants in their arms. Deep underground, in the dark recesses of mines and quarries, others chipped away at rock and coal with primitive tools, dragging heavy loads upward toward daylight. Death waited in silence. Accidents, collapses, explosions, or the slow suffocating decline of black lung claimed many lives. And for those who escaped these fates, comfort was rare. Families huddled in low-roofed, smoke-filled huts, often sharing their one-room dwellings with animals to retain warmth against the punishing cold of Scotland's winters. Their meals were meagre. Oats, barley, and hardy vegetables coaxed from unforgiving soil, with a piece of meat or fish seen as rare good fortune. hunger lingered always, and in years of famine or war, when enemy bands burned crops and slaughtered livestock, the people grew desperate. Some ate grass, tree bark, even earth itself, just to quiet the gnawing emptiness inside. Their bodies shrank, weakened, and many faded away to nothing but bone and shadow. Always, too, illness crept close. In a time long before modern medicine, even the smallest sickness might end in death. Outbreaks of typhoid, smallpox, or plague would sweep through entire villages like a wind of fire, leaving behind heartbreak and silence. For a peasant family scraping by in such a wild and unforgiving land, life was a continual trial, a dawn-to-dusk battle to survive. They rose before the sun to tend their soil and animals, working until their fingers split and their muscles burned with exhaustion. They ate what little they could gather, curled tightly together in drafty homes riddled with vermin, seeking warmth through the long, bitter nights. Yet even amidst these struggles, they found small joys, fragile lights in the darkness. With each changing season, they marked festivals and holy days, dancing to the sound of pipes and fiddles beneath the stars. They gathered close around the hearth, telling stories and singing songs, keeping alive the tales and customs of their forebears. They turned to faith for comfort, seeking peace in the rituals and words offered by the church, even as that same church demanded tithes and obedience. Most of all, they leaned on one another. Bonds of kin and community held them upright when all else seemed lost. Still, the church, though it promised a better world to come, was not free from blame in the world they knew. Alongside the clans, it reigned as one of the mightiest forces in medieval Scotland, touching nearly every facet of daily life. No matter one's station, be it humble peasant or noble lord, all were expected to offer a portion of their meagre earnings to the church, helping sustain the wealth and splendour of bishops and abbots, who lived far removed from the suffering of those they claimed to shepherd. While their own households often endured hunger, the church maintained control over immense stretches of land, and exercised both secular and sacred authority over the people. Yet it was in the realm of belief and moral conduct where the church's influence proved most deeply entrenched. The Bible's teachings, alongside papal decrees, were treated as absolute truths. Straying from these doctrines invited harsh and immediate reprisals. Those labelled as heretics or blasphemers faced judgment in ecclesiastical courts, where they could be imprisoned, tortured, or even condemned to die by fire for defying what was declared as divine law. This authority extended into the most private corners of daily life. Marriage, viewed as a sacred union, was under firm clerical control, and approval from the clergy could be granted or withheld at their discretion. Divorce was nearly unthinkable, and any soul who dared challenge the church's views on chastity or sexuality risked public humiliation or even excommunication. And still, amid these rigid rules, the church remained a place where many found solace and shelter. Across the land, monasteries and abbeys stood not only as religious centres, but also as havens of compassion. Within their stone walls, monks and nuns cared for the ill, offered bread to the hungry, and welcomed weary travellers with warmth and prayer. Among the many remembered with reverence was St. Margaret, the devout English princess who, in the 11th century, became Queen of Scotland. With a heart guided by deep piety, Margaret used her position to bring reform to the Scottish Church, aligning its customs more closely with Rome and championing education, charity, and care for the poor. She founded hospitals, funded orphanages, supported the construction of chapels, and worked earnestly to relieve the burdens of those most in need. Her memory endured long beyond her lifetime, with generations of Scots invoking her name in times of hardship, seeing in her both guardian and intercessor. Yet even Margaret's legacy of mercy could not cleanse all the shadows cast by ecclesiastical rule. As fear of witchcraft and heresy began to take firmer root in the minds of the people, the Church intensified its efforts to identify and punish those suspected of dealings with dark forces. In the 16th and 17th centuries, witch trials became a grim fixture in Scottish life. Suspected witches, often women, were subjected to cruel questioning and forced to confess under duress. Many were tortured or burned alive, their screams rising into the sky as a grim lesson for any who might stray from righteous faith. Thus the people of Scotland lived under the constant weight of dual allegiance, bound to both their clan leaders and the commands of the Church. Their lives were shaped by competing loyalties, caught between the need for communal solidarity and the demands of religious obedience. They turned to their chiefs for guidance and defence, yet dreaded the cost of disobedience or defiance. It was a fragile balance, one that could be unsettled at any moment by war's arrival or the cruel turns of fate. As the pages of history turned, those very winds began to stir with growing intensity. While the clans struggled among themselves and the church tightened its grasp, a fresh danger emerged from the south. The English monarchy, long eyeing Scotland's lands and resources, viewed the northern realm as an untamed expanse ripe for domination. In the year 1296, Edward I of England, dubbed Longshanks for his great stature, unleashed a sweeping invasion, proclaiming his dominion over the Scottish crown. His forces surged across the border, devastating villages and silencing all opposition. The Scots, caught unprepared and vastly outnumbered, were swiftly subdued. Their monarch, John Balliol, was taken prisoner and stripped of his crown, which Edward then claimed as his own prize. Scotland now lay under foreign rule, its people bound to unfamiliar laws and overseen by foreign masters. Yet the flame of resistance had not been extinguished. In the turbulent years that followed, wave upon wave of revolt would shake the foundations of English dominance. These rebellions were led by bold and determined men whose names would echo through time. One such leader was William Wallace, a knight of modest birth from Renfrew, who rose to command a guerrilla force that would strike fear into the English heart. Wallace, driven by unshakable patriotism and righteous anger toward the oppressors of his homeland, called his countrymen to arms. Under his banner, the Scots launched daring ambushes and raids, disrupting enemy supply lines and dismantling garrisons. His most celebrated triumph came in 1297 at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. There, despite being greatly outnumbered, Wallace's men exploited the narrow crossing to their advantage, forcing the English into a deadly bottleneck. Into a deadly trap they were led, cut down by the thousands. Wallace's feats transformed him into a cherished symbol for the Scottish people, a figure of defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. Yet his victories would not last. In 1298 he faced a formidable English army at the Battle of Falkirk, and was ultimately defeated. His forces scattered, and with them his reputation began to fade. Over the following years, Wallace evaded capture, continuing his guerrilla tactics in defiance of English control. But in 1305, betrayal found him. A fellow Scot delivered him to Edward's men. Shackled in chains, he was transported to London, where a grim fate awaited. In the capital, Wallace stood accused of treason. On August 23rd, he endured a cruel punishment. Dragged through the streets on a wooden hurdle, his body broken by previous torture, he arrived at Smithfield. There he suffered a brutal end, hanged, drawn, and quartered. His severed head was displayed atop London Bridge, a chilling warning to all who might challenge English authority. Yet, his memory refused to die. Wallace's martyrdom ignited the hopes of future patriots. In 1314, the torch he once carried was lifted again, this time at the Battle of Bannockburn. It was there that Robert the Bruce, having claimed the Scottish crown in open defiance of English rule, faced off against a vastly superior enemy. The English army, larger in number and stronger in arms, underestimated what awaited them. The Scots possessed a powerful secret, the schiltron, a dense formation of spearmen, trained to withstand even the fiercest cavalry. As the English forces surged forward, confident in their impending triumph, they were met with a forest of spears, each one steady and unyielding. The schiltrons absorbed the attack, then countered with crushing intensity. The battle thundered on for hours. Metal clanged against metal, the cries of wounded men filling the air. But in the end, it was the Scots who stood victorious. Their unity and bravery broke through the English line. Bannockburn marked a pivotal moment in the War for Independence, a day when the dream of freedom felt suddenly within reach. Still, the road ahead remained treacherous. The years that followed brought continued strife, as Stuart monarchs struggled to assert control over powerful nobles and fractious clans. Meanwhile, the common folk of Scotland continued to face challenges nearly beyond imagination. Their daily existence was not only threatened by enemy blades or rivalries, but also by the land itself. Scotland's rough, unyielding terrain and harsh weather made agriculture a punishing labour. The acidic soil yielded poor harvests, while cold and damp crept through every crack, into every bone. From dawn to dusk, peasants worked the land, planting oats, barley and peas in narrow strips, dragging wooden ploughs behind oxen. Beside their cottages, modest gardens grew turnips and cabbage, though any failed crop could mean a winter of hunger. Worse still, their burdens were made heavier by feudal obligations. Tenant farmers owed large portions of their yield to local lords as rent. These noblemen saw little shame in squeezing every last grain from their tenants, often leaving families with barely enough to survive. In those times, a man's standing was not measured by wealth and coin, but by the number of cattle he owned and the strength he could wield with a sword. And swords were often needed, even in places far removed from the grand battlefields of kings. Rural farmers lived with constant fear. Highland raiders could descend without warning, seeking livestock or revenge. This was a world that forged hard men through harder circumstances. Feuds simmered and flared for generations, often without resolution. Even blood ties could fray under the weight of grinding poverty and relentless tension. Marriage for many was less a union of hearts than a necessity, a way to share labour and secure survival. For most women, their wedding day might be the only time they wore shoes, likely handmade from cowhide for that brief occasion. Children, in turn, were seen both as joy and burden, a future hope and a present hardship, all at once. More mouths to feed often meant deeper hunger, but they also brought more hands to share the burden in the fields and peat bogs, cutting heavy slabs of dense turf to burn for warmth or cooking. Sons were treasured for their future strength in defending the clan's honour, while daughters were frequently wed in their early teens to cement strategic alliances. The wails of mourning mothers echoed through the glens far too often, as many infants succumbed to illness, malnutrition, or the cold itself. And yet, despite all the pain they bore, the people of Scotland held fast to life, and to the traditions that gave it meaning. These tightly woven clans, though frequently locked in fierce rivalries, also offered each person a place, a sense of purpose and belonging beyond the self. Devotion to one's kin was a flickering flame that kept their spirits warm against the chill of such a demanding life. The Catholic Church too brought comfort and structure amidst disorder. Parish priests might preach with the threat of eternal damnation, but they also christened newborns, united couples in holy matrimony, and eased the dying into the next world with whispered last rites. The great abbeys and priories that dotted the Scottish landscape were more than spiritual bastions. They were centres of learning, of kindness, and of refuge. Even the poorest serf might find shelter and food within their walls. Among these places, Dunfermline Abbey stood out, both as the final resting place of Scottish kings and as the birthplace of a woman who would come to shape the soul of a nation, Margaret. Born in exile as an English princess, Margaret grew into a woman of unwavering piety and quiet strength. When she journeyed north in 1070 to marry King Malcolm III, what she found troubled her deeply. The Christianity she encountered in her new home was far from the devout order she had known, a blend of old Celtic customs and loosely observed Roman rites. Disturbed but undeterred, Queen Margaret began the work of reform. With steadfast resolve, she sought to draw the Scottish Church into closer alignment with Roman authority. She called for Sabbath observance to be taken seriously, no longer treated like any other workday. Priests who performed Mass while sipping ale were reprimanded under her watchful eye. Perhaps most significantly, Margaret championed the use of Latin in worship and the reverence of relics, gradually replacing Gaelic traditions with Roman ones. Though her life was one of royal comfort, Queen Margaret never turned away from those in need. Out of her own resources, she financed a ferry across the Firth of Forth to allow pilgrims easier access to the shrine of St. Andrew. She humbled herself by washing the feet of the poor and gave generously to the destitute, a living example of Christian grace, despite her lofty position. So compelling was her presence, so steady her convictions, that she even softened the heart of her warrior husband. King Malcolm, known for his rough justice, gradually adopted more merciful ways, influenced by his wife's example. Their union bridged two royal bloodlines, Anglo-Saxon and Celtic, and symbolised a fragile harmony in a land long divided. But their shared reign would not last. In 1093, grief took hold, news arrived that King Malcolm and their eldest son had perished in battle against the English. Margaret, already ailing, collapsed under the weight of sorrow. As she lay dying, she clutched sacred relics to her chest, whispering prayers with her final breath, her faith unwavering to the very end. Though her time as queen was brief, she would be remembered not simply as Margaret, but as Saint Margaret, a figure who cast a long and luminous shadow over Scotland's religious and royal history. Her reforms brought the Scottish Church more fully into communion with Europe, and through her guidance of a battle-hardened king, she helped shape a monarchy that would grow in strength and stature. Yet for the countless ordinary souls she sought to protect, those grand shifts remained distant. Their days went on, filled with labour, loss, and quiet endurance, as the great tides of history surged and receded around them. And as one century gave way to the next, the shadow of death never strayed far from their hearths. In 1350, it arrived on the backs of rats aboard ships from distant ports. The Black Death had reached Scottish shores. What came was not a swift blow, but a creeping, suffocating fog. It entered through busy ports and seeped into the countryside with terrifying speed. The chronicler John of Fordun would later recount what he saw. Scenes so grim they left lasting scars in memory. The silence of abandoned homes, the air thick with sorrow, and the unbearable weight of mass graves that marked the land. Mortality first took hold in Scotland, and there, countless lives were lost. The destruction was so immense that few dared venture beyond their doors, fearing the invisible plague that could strike without warning. When the illness entered a household, it often took every soul within. No clan, no village was untouched. In some corners of the land, entire bloodlines vanished. Their bodies, left in sorrowful silence, were either stacked upon one another in the streets, or placed hastily in communal graves dug by trembling hands. Those who fell ill were shunned, abandoned in isolation as they groaned in suffering. Their bodies swelled with black buboes in the groin and beneath the arms, their skin darkened with blotches and signs of rot. Panic spread faster than the sickness itself. Fear and wild superstition filled the void left by reason. There were whispers blaming the Jews, accusing them of poisoning wells. Others believed this plague to be divine wrath, punishment for humanity's transgressions. Across the countryside, bands of flagellants wandered, whipping themselves into bloodied ecstasy in hopes of absolving the world's sins. By the time the worst had passed, Scotland had lost nearly 1/3 of its people. Fields lay fallow, for there were no hands left to till them. Cattle roamed freely, untended, and goods sat unsold in marketplaces now eerily silent. It was a wound from which recovery would take generations. Still, despite the devastation, life, in its quiet resilience, carried on. Those who survived mourned their loved ones, rebuilt their homes, and began slowly to gather the scattered fragments of their world. They held fast to the rhythm of the seasons, to the customs that had shaped their ancestors' lives for centuries. In the Highlands, clans continued to gather for the great cattle drives that marked the year's turning. They led their herds to summer pastures and brought them home again, a ritual as ancient as the hills. The mournful skirl of bagpipes echoed through the glens, a sound steeped in sorrow, yet unbroken in spirit, a sound that reminded them they had endured. Meanwhile, the burghs of the lowlands stirred once more, artisans returned to their trades, merchants reopened their stalls, and life crept back into the great fairs that had once sustained Scotland's economy. Buyers and sellers, cautious but hopeful, began to reappear. Trade resumed. Wool, hides, salt, and smoked fish all began to flow again, binding together the frayed seams of a wounded nation. But even as the country regained its balance, fresh tensions waited ahead. Though Queen Margaret's earlier efforts had drawn the Scottish Church closer to its European counterparts, many still clung to the older Celtic faith. And as the Stuart monarchs extended their influence, the chasm between Gaelic-speaking Highlanders and Scots-speaking Lowlanders widened. In the north, clan chiefs ruled almost as kings, delivering judgment and commanding loyalty with authority that rivaled any crown. The lives of ordinary folk remained closely tied to the land. Day by day they tended crops and cared for livestock, working tirelessly beneath skies both fair and cruel. They lived in thatched huts, their few belongings a testament to hard times. Among them was Angus MacTavish, a tenant bound to Clan Campbell's estate, From dawn until dusk, Angus laboured, pushing his plough through stubborn soil, guiding his sickle through the grain. He would pause now and then to wipe the sweat from his brow, his eyes squinting against the sun's harsh glare. Not far off stood the stone tower of the Campbell chief, a towering silhouette that reminded Angus always who held power over his fate. As he turned back to his toil, his thoughts wandered to the recent raid by Clan MacDonald. The chaos still echoed in his memory, cattle bellowing in terror, steel crashing against steel, and men screaming in the bloodied grass. Angus had escaped with his life, but his brother had not been as fortunate. Now there were whispers of vengeance, of summoning the clan once more, blades drawn and banners raised for a retaliatory blow. Angus felt a dull weight settle in his chest at the thought of further bloodshed, more lives taken in the name of pride and legacy. Such was the endless rhythm of raid followed counter, raid, feud bred vendetta. And so the Highlands remained steeped in turmoil. For centuries the clans clashed endlessly, their animosities passed down like heirlooms. It became more than conflict. It was a way of life, woven into the very hills and mist-veiled glens that shaped their world. Yet while these rival clans fought among themselves, a far greater threat steadily crept from the south. The English crown had long looked northward with ambition, seeking to bring Scotland beneath its control. In 1296, Edward I of England, known as Longshanks due to his imposing height, launched a fierce invasion. His armies stormed across the border, laying waste to villages and towns, putting to the sword any who dared to resist. Outnumbered though they were, the Scots refused to yield. They fought fiercely, turning the rugged landscape to their advantage, and disrupting the English with relentless guerrilla attacks. Among the most celebrated figures of that resistance was William Wallace, a lesser nobleman from Renfrewshire. Wallace harboured a deep and personal hatred for the English, who had taken his wife's life and razed his home. Gathering loyal supporters, he began a daring campaign against the occupiers, striking with courage and cunning. His most notable triumph came at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297. The English, brimming with overconfidence, attempted to cross the narrow bridge over the River Forth. Wallace and his men waited patiently, then launched their attack, when half the English force was across, trapping them and cutting them down in devastating numbers. That victory electrified the Scottish people, inspiring renewed hope and instilling dread in their enemies. Yet Wallace's moment of glory was fleeting. The following year, Edward V returned with a vast army, intent on crushing the rebellion once and for all. At the Battle of Falkirk, the Scottish spearmen, arranged in dense schiltron formations, were no match for the English longbowmen. Wallace narrowly avoided capture, but his army scattered, and with it Scotland fell deeper into English control. In the years that followed, the grip of occupation tightened. Scottish nobles were compelled to swear fealty to Edward, and English officials were appointed to oversee the conquered lands. For the common people, life became even more harsh. Their homes were destroyed if they were suspected of harbouring rebels. Their harvests and livestock were seized to feed foreign troops. Yet, even amid these bleakest days, small lights continued to burn. In the scattered abbeys and priories that dotted the countryside, monks and nuns offered refuge and compassion. They healed the wounded, cared for the poor, and whispered prayers for the broken. One such light was Margaret of Wessex, an English princess who became Queen to Malcolm III of Scotland in 1070. Though born across the border, Margaret embraced her new land and worked ceaselessly to uplift its people. She became beloved for her generosity and deep faith, founding hospitals and schools, and feeding the hungry from her own table. Through her influence, Margaret reformed the Scottish Church, which had fallen into disorder. She welcomed English monks to share their teachings and encouraged the adoption of Roman Catholic rites and practices. These reforms helped forge a lasting bond between Scotland and the papacy, a spiritual connection that would shape the nation's religious path for centuries. But as the Church's authority grew, so too did its capacity to sow fear. For the ordinary folk, it was often as much a source of dread as it was of comfort. The medieval Church moved swiftly against dissent. Those accused of heresy or unorthodox beliefs were often tortured, sometimes executed, their confessions torn from them in anguish. One especially fervent voice of that era was John Knox, a fiery preacher who railed against witchcraft and Catholic influence. In 1563 he published a vitriolic pamphlet titled The First Blast of the Trumpet against the monstrous regiment of women, wherein he condemned female rulers and declared that Mary, Queen of Scots, was a wicked figure akin to Jezebel. Knox's scathing rhetoric helped fan the flames of fear, fueling the witch trials that swept through Scotland in the 16th and 17th centuries, even as those flames of... The state turned upon the accused, and yet the people of Scotland endured. They held fast to their ancient customs and the rich tapestry of folklore passed down through generations. In stories of gallant warriors and fantastical beasts, they found comfort. There was quiet beauty in their rugged homeland, in the heather-strewn moorlands, in the glens cloaked with drifting mist, and there was power in their unwavering identity, in their resolute refusal to be broken or assimilated by their southern neighbours. That fierce determination would lead, in 1320, to a defining moment, the signing of the Declaration of Arbroath. It was a bold statement of Scottish sovereignty and pride. For as long as but 100 of us remain alive, the Declaration proclaimed, never will we on any conditions be brought under English dominion. It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honours that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone, which no honest man gives up but with life itself. These words would echo through the ages, a clarion call that stirred the hearts of countless Scots who would fight and fall for liberty. Though the road ahead would be long and cruel, though blood would soak the soil and sorrow fill the air, their vision of a free Scotland would never fade from view. As the evening sun dipped behind the distant peaks, Angus MacTavish rose from his labour, his back sore from the day's demands. Gazing across the fields bathed in soft golden light, he felt a quiet reverence stir within him. Despite the relentless hardships, the spectre of war, the hunger of famine, the grip of illness, Angus carried in his chest a fierce and abiding love for his homeland. It was that very love that helped him endure, that pushed him forward each morning when the sky was still dark. And he knew deep down that this same devotion lived in every Scot, from the humblest crofter to the mightiest laird. It was a love that endured unchanged, as steadfast as the old stone walls of the castles that watched silently over the land. Angus turned, beginning the familiar path toward his modest cottage. His steps were slow, heavy with fatigue, yet inside him glowed a quiet ember of hope, a stubborn flame that refused to flicker out. For he understood with the wisdom earned from hardship that no night lasted forever, no winter remained without end. Spring would return, as it always did, carrying the promise of renewal, a brighter day, a fresh beginning, not only for himself, but for all of Scotland and her people. The story of medieval Scotland is one steeped in sacrifice, a tale of blood spilled and courage tested, of grit and grace rising to meet impossible odds. It speaks to the strength of a people forged in centuries of hardship, shaped by adversity into something enduring. And when they look back, when they remember those long ago generations and the unyielding faith they carried, they cannot help but feel humbled and inspired. For in the victories and in the sorrows of those who came before, they glimpse their own hopes, their own trials. It is through these stories passed from tongue to tongue that they feel the deep, invisible threads that tie one age to the next. So let them remember the brave and defiant Scots whose footsteps carved the road they walk today. Let them honour those lives and sacrifices, and strive to be worthy of the legacy left behind. In the end, it is not crowns nor stone keeps that define a people, but the spirit in their hearts and the fire in their hopes. And as long as those hearts remain true, as long as hope continues to burn, Scotland will stand. She will remain a land of myth and memory, of quiet strength and wild beauty, now and always. As history has shown, conflicts between rival clans were a hallmark of life in medieval Scotland. Yet one feud would rise above the rest in both savagery and duration: the bitter, enduring enmity between Clan Campbell and Clan MacDonald. The roots of this infamous rivalry reached back to the early 14th century, when Robert the Bruce rewarded the Campbells with the lordship of Lorne, lands that the MacDonalds regarded as sacred ancestral ground. They seethed at what they saw as an intrusion, a usurpation by a rising clan who had stolen what was rightfully theirs. From this contested territory, generations of bloodshed took root. The feud reached its most horrifying crescendo in 1646, during what would become known as the Dunaverty Massacre. Over 300 MacDonald men, women and children had sought shelter within the walls of Dunaverty Castle, hoping to escape the overwhelming numbers of the advancing Campbells. The Campbells laid siege to the fortress, pounding its walls with cannon fire. With no hope of escape, the MacDonalds surrendered, expecting imprisonment, not slaughter. But Captain Gillespie, chief of the Campbell forces, had other plans. In a chilling act of betrayal, his soldiers executed the surrendered MacDonalds one by one. They had laid down their arms, trusting they'd be spared. Even the most innocent, women and children, were cut down without mercy. The aftermath was brutal. The bodies of the slain were hurled from the cliffs into the sea, the tide carrying them away. This massacre left a stain on the Campbell name, a wound remembered for generations. And yet in the shifting world of Highland politics, even bitter enemies found moments of uneasy alliance. In the 1490s, during King James IV's campaign to bring order to the unruly Highlands, the MacDonalds were stripped of their centuries-old title, Lords of the Isles. Surprisingly, it was the Campbell Earl of Argyll who argued to preserve some of the MacDonalds' holdings, not from affection, but to maintain a power structure favourable to his own clan. Such was the tangled web of Highland diplomacy. One sworn enemy might, by the next season, become a vital ally against a shared threat. These ever-changing allegiances mirrored the broader struggles of Scotland itself, caught between mighty powers. During repeated English invasions in the 13th and 14th centuries, the long-standing alliance with France became a lifeline. French military support offered a counterweight to southern aggression. But that alliance, too, was fragile, often shaped by the changing winds of royal ambition. For Highlanders living in the path of raiders and reprisals, life demanded constant alertness. Across the landscape rose crumbling stone peel towers, which served both as watchposts and places of refuge. When rival clans rode in to burn, steal, or take revenge, there was often no warning. A perceived insult, a dispute over pasture, or a failed cattle raid could ignite battle in moments. Men worked their fields with weapons never far from reach, a sword at the hip, a dirk in the boot, ready to rally beneath the clan banner. Women and children, too, knew to remain vigilant. They learned early to listen for the blare of the cow horn, or the dreaded rallying cry, "Groom do up, prepare for the fight." In times of siege, they fled to the tower clutching sacks of oats, strips of dried herring, whatever might sustain them through the long wait. Even a Highlander's attire reflected the reality of war. Most were never without their arms, a broadsword, a round targa shield, and a long dirk for close quarters combat. Those of means added a hauberk, a vest of chainmail that protected their torso. And when the rare peace settled over the glens, they tested themselves in sport. Contests of strength, mock skirmishes, caber tossing, and lifting heavy stones. Such preparations weren't games. They were survival. In the Highlands, to lose a feud was to risk complete ruin. Entire clans could be wiped out, their cattle taken, their homes destroyed, their families exiled or enslaved. Defeated warriors, if not executed outright, might become servants to their victors, left landless and destitute. So the work of a clan chief was never done. Alliances had to be forged and maintained with care, sealed through marriages, the fostering of children, or oaths made on relics held sacred. Behind every sword raised in battle was a season of bargaining, planning, and solemn vows. The invisible threads of a fragile order. Favour from the powerful magnates, the Lords of the Isles, the Earls of Mar and Moray, the Stuart monarchs, was fleeting if they even acknowledged the Highlands at all. For in that dense and treacherous web of loyalties, only those with strength and cunning could hope to endure. Yet despite the relentless violence and hardship that surrounded them, the Gaels of the Highlands managed to preserve a remarkably rich clan culture. To them, the clan was everything, their name, their purpose, and the closest thing they had to a social safety net in a land where other protections barely existed. Life was harsh and often short, yet it pulsed with a raw, untamed communal energy that would be difficult to grasp in the modern world. Grand feasts and jubilant gatherings marked the Highland calendar, moments when kin would unite in ceremony and splendour. Women dressed in embroidered silks, Men stood proud in woven tartans and bonnets crowned with plumes. The haunting call of bagpipes filled the glens, and under starry skies they revelled into the night, with songs, with stories, and with the golden usgebata, the water of life, their soul-stealing whiskey. However brief these moments were, they served as vivid reminders of togetherness, of being part of something larger than one's lonely croft. Even the chieftains, despite their endless quarrels, envisioned themselves as more than warriors. They saw themselves as noble custodians of Gaelic tradition, guardians of heritage, and patrons of knowledge and art. Within their halls, bards recited ancient verses in grand fashion, accompanied by the delicate strains of wire-strung harps. These chiefs took pride in supporting artisans, weavers, armourers, silversmiths, who created the distinctive dirks, brooches, and tartans that formed the visible thread of Highland identity. But before one romanticises such a world too deeply, it's vital to remember that this was a life forged in adversity. A world where hardship was constant, and people aged far beyond their years through toil and hunger. A failed harvest or outbreak among the cattle could spell ruin, not only for common folk, but for their chiefs as well. The threat of sudden violence never slept. So, as they drift deeper into rest, let them spare a thought for those long-ago Highlanders. May the comfort of a warm bed feel sweeter, knowing how rare such warmth once was in those desperate days. And when dawn rises again, perhaps it will be met with a little more gratitude, a little more humility. For though today's burdens feel heavy, they scarcely compare to the bitter weight carried across a single lifetime in those fog-laced wilds of ancient Scotland. Still, even amid the perils faced by Highland lords and their fighting men, the common folk, those at the lowest rung of Scotland's medieval society, bore the harshest existence of all. These were the peasants labouring in quiet obscurity, enduring relentless poverty with almost no rights, and even fewer chances at respite. From the first light of morning until darkness fell, their days were spent in unyielding physical toil. Most eked out survival on tiny rented plots or crofts, narrow strips of land that just barely fed a family. Their tools were simple and worn: wooden ploughs, handheld flails, and crooked sickles. With these, they fought against the stubborn Highland earth and the soaking rains that could, in a single storm, wipe out months of hope. Many were husbandmen, cultivating oats, barley, and rye on leased acres, while praying to keep a milk cow if fortune allowed. Oats became meal, turned into coarse bannocks or porridge, bland and gritty, but enough to fill an empty belly. Barley and rye were often handed over as rent or tithe, with just enough kept aside to brew ale, which was usually safer to drink than the foul, polluted water nearby. The luckier tenants were those with hereditary rights to their crofts, their rents fixed and paid in produce. But many more were tenants at will, entirely at the mercy of landlords who could raise demands overnight, or expel entire families with no warning, clearing space for the more profitable cattle trade. And even beneath them still were the cotters. Landless and forgotten, they hired out their labour for scraps, working the fields of better-off peasants or serving in the great halls of clan chiefs as the lowest kind of attendants. Regardless of where they ended up, famine always loomed nearby. Even in years when harvests were fair, the rural poor lived with chronic deficiency. Their food was sparse in nourishment. Meat, when it appeared, was a rare indulgence, and salt fish came only now and then. Most meals consisted of a thin, oat-based stew mixed with vegetables and perhaps a sliver of tough mutton if fortune smiled. Deficiencies in vital nutrients led to widespread afflictions. Scurvy and rickets, born of the absence of vitamins C and D, left them weak, unable to work the land that barely sustained them. When the harvest failed, true hunger took hold. The chronicler John Barber wrote grimly of the famine from 1315 to 1317. When endless rain drowned the crops in their soil. Desperate and starving, the poorest began to eat bark and grass, and even slaughtered their own plough animals before dying in large numbers. Disease too found easy purchase in the fetid, overcrowded villages of medieval Scotland. Dysentery, tuberculosis, and sepsis from minor wounds spread easily, and always lurking was the spectre of the Black Death. A plague that cared little for rank, felling rich and poor alike. For a peasant eking out a life from the soil, access to medicine was almost non-existent. The herbs of wise women and folk healers were rare comforts, the formal care of clerics and barber surgeons even rarer. Thus played out the unrelenting logic of medieval survival. Infants often did not live beyond their first years. Mothers died giving birth. Fathers fell to disease or injury while still young. If a peasant child managed to survive malnutrition and illness, their life expectancy hovered around 30 years, a span that by any modern measure seems heartbreakingly brief. And woven through all of it was the rigid structure of power. The peasantry owed unwavering obedience to their clan leaders and the noble landlords whose land they worked. That obedience was not optional, it was enforced with violence. To question authority was to risk flogging, mutilation, or death. Whatever they produced, whatever they built or harvested, was never truly theirs. It belonged, in practice, to someone above them. Their existence was bound in labour, narrow in scope, and stripped of dignity. Each day a test of endurance and submission, with only the smallest joys to hold on to. A wedding feast, a child's laughter, a quiet moment before a smoky peat fire. That was all the hard arithmetic of poverty and power allowed. Yet somehow, even in that bleak and unforgiving world, flickers of resilience remained. There was pride in their traditions, in the rituals and rhythms that structured their lives. They sang planting songs across the damp fields, offered whispered prayers for protection from fairies and spirits said to roam the moors. They passed along the visions of seers like Thomas the Rhymer, who foretold a time when the low would rise and the mighty would fall. Change, though distant, would come. The Protestant Reformation would shatter the dominance of Catholic bishops and clan lords. The Enlightenment, with its calls for freedom and whiskey, would stir new ideas of justice and rights. The Highland clearances would bring both sorrow and strange opportunity, scattering them across oceans toward lives they could scarcely imagine. A better world beckoned, even if it would come too late for them. So let them be remembered. As we nestle into the warmth and safety of modern comfort, let a small thought drift backward. A moment of quiet gratitude for those who came before. Their toil was nameless, their suffering unrecorded, but their calloused hands and weary backs laid the foundations of everything that followed. And tonight, if in dreams we sip from the bitter cup they once drank, may it stir us not to pity, but to purpose. A shared vow to shape a future where dignity is not a privilege, but a given. Rest well, friends, and when morning light returns, spare a thought for the least among them, those long-forgotten peasants of Scotland's difficult past. While the clansmen and peasants of medieval Scotland endured grinding lives of hardship, there remained one institution that towered above them all, the formidable Catholic Church. From magnificent cathedrals to remote chapels of stone, the reach of the church extended into every corner of life. In village lanes and castle halls alike, the clergy stood as ever-present symbols, the visible hand of divine order and earthly power. Of the church's far-reaching authority, there was no corner untouched, from learned bishops presiding over great abbeys to modest parish priests tending flocks in distant glens. This clerical order stood as a parallel power to the clan system, and in many ways wielded even greater influence. For it was the church that claimed dominion over souls, holding the keys to salvation and wielding the terrifying weight of eternal judgment. In a time haunted by disease, violence, and short lifespans, the promise of heaven and the threat of hell governed both conduct and conscience, demanding unquestioning obedience. That obedience was enforced through heavy tithes and offerings, burdens the peasantry had no choice but to carry, often at unbearable cost. The command to render unto God what is God's, as interpreted by the clergy, left many crofters with barely enough to feed their families. Those who strayed from doctrine or defied clerical authority faced swift and unforgiving retribution. The moral code was policed harshly. An unwed mother might be paraded in shame before the congregation, while anyone accused of heresy could be dragged into a church court, facing torture and at worst execution. The church used its wealth to construct towering edifices meant to humble and inspire. Majestic abbeys like Melrose, Jedburgh and Dunfermline rose from stone, marvels of Gothic architecture and craftsmanship. Their soaring arches and detailed carvings spoke not only of divine glory, but of immense institutional power. Within their cloisters thrived a world of quiet scholarship, far removed from the peasants' daily hardship. Monks laboured by candlelight in scriptoriums, carefully copying sacred texts and recording the chronicles of a restless age. Nuns cultivated physic gardens, healing the ill with herbal lore passed down through generations. Their liturgy, composed of Latin poetry and soaring polyphonic chants, floated like incense above the crude dialects of field and fen. For the younger sons of noble families, the church offered an avenue to advancement. Many rose through its ranks, becoming abbots and bishops who controlled lands and vassals, collected taxes, dispensed justice, and even summoned armies. These men stood not just as spiritual leaders, but as diplomats and political players in the delicate game of clan and crown. One such figure was William de Lamberton, Bishop of St. Andrews in the early 14th century. A master strategist in a perilous time. Navigating between the pressures of English rule and the hopes of Scottish patriots, Lamberton eventually cast his loyalty behind Robert the Bruce. His timely support proved instrumental in Scotland's quest for independence and shaped the kingdom's destiny. Yet the church's temporal wealth also bred indulgence and moral decay. Many bishops and abbots lived lavishly, surrounded by attendants and feasting, while their flocks struggled through hunger and despair. The noble vows of poverty, chastity, and humility were too often neglected by a clergy grown entitled on the sweat of the poor. It was this disparity, this excess, that gave rise to whispers of reform. These stirrings of dissent found voice in the southwest of Scotland, where the Lollards, followers of English reformer John Wycliffe, began to challenge Rome's authority. Long before Luther's hammer echoed through Wittenberg, the Lollards called for sermons in the vernacular and denounced the sale of indulgences. Their preaching laid the early groundwork for the Reformation to come, foreshadowing the collapse of Catholic hegemony across Scotland. Yet despite its failings, the medieval church also offered a kind of refuge, a fragile bulwark against the cruelty of the age. In times of feud and raid, the law of sanctuary extended by abbeys and priories gave protection to the vulnerable. Soup kitchens run by monks and nuns were often the last hope for the starving. Parish priests, though bound by hierarchy, served as counsellors, teachers, and mediators within their communities. In a largely illiterate world, the church preserved the flickering flame of knowledge, from Greek philosophy to Latin scripture, and even the rudiments of natural science. Learning endured within monastic walls. And as the Stuart line tightened its grasp on the Scottish throne in the 15th century, the realm remained fractured, stitched together by clan loyalties, old rivalries, and fragile oaths. The new Stuart kings looked northward, hoping to draw the distant highlands under firmer royal control. But this ambition would not come easily. For generations, the Gaelic-speaking clans had governed themselves, their own realm, a rugged and untamed land of mist-covered lochs, jagged mountains, and formidable warriors. To many in the lowlands, the Highlanders seemed wild and unfamiliar. They spoke a language that sounded strange, dressed in unusual garments, and gave their loyalty to clan chiefs rather than the distant crown. Lowlanders often looked down on Highland traditions, especially quert, awikit, or sorning, the practice that allowed a chief and his followers to demand food and shelter from their clan's people. Stories of cattle theft, blood feuds, and what they viewed as lawlessness or savagery only deepened their mistrust. One figure came to embody Highland resistance to Stuart authority, the Lord of the Isles. Since the 13th century, these Gaelic nobles had governed a wide expanse of the Western Highlands and surrounding islands as a semi-independent lordship, operating from their seat at Finlagan Castle on Islay. The Lords of the Isles maintained their own courts, clashed with rival clans, and even treated directly with the English crown, acting almost as if they were sovereign rulers. In 1462, John MacDonald II, the fourth Lord of the Isles, attempted to extend his power at the Scottish crown's expense. He led an uprising against King James III, but was defeated near Inverness. As punishment, James stripped MacDonald of his titles and imposed direct royal control over the Isles. Later, in 1493, James IV suppressed another revolt and permanently annexed the lordship to Scotland. This marked the end of the Lords of the Isles and a significant shift in the Crown's centuries-long mission to bring Gaeldom under firm control. Yet the Highlands would not bend easily. The remoteness of the land, its harsh geography, and deeply rooted clan loyalties resisted royal influence for generations. Kings like James V tried, and failed, to pacify the region. In 1540, James sailed around the Western Isles with a show of naval force, accepting the submission of various clan leaders in person. But these ceremonial gestures did little to transform the deeply embedded social fabric of Highland life. Language remained one of the most striking symbols of the cultural divide. Gaelic, a Celtic tongue closely tied to Irish, was central to Highland identity. It was the speech of the bards, those who kept clan histories, recited genealogies, and told stories that defined collective memory. In contrast, Lowlanders spoke Scots, a Germanic language closer to English. As Lowland political power increased, efforts to suppress Gaelic expanded. The Stuart monarchs began to see Gaelic not as a proud tradition, but as a marker of rebellion and disorder. In 1616, James VI and I enacted the Statutes of Iona, which required Highland chiefs to send their heirs to Lowland schools to learn English and Protestant doctrine. Later laws targeted not only the language, but Highland customs more broadly. The Speaking Our Language Act of 1724 enforced English education and banned Gaelic in formal settings. These laws, though not always fully effective, gradually eroded the official status of the Gaelic tongue. Still, despite long-standing mistrust and the Crown's repeated attempts at Anglicisation, the Highlands and Lowlands were never entirely cut off from one another. Trade, particularly in cattle, became a vital link. At bustling fairs like Crieff, Falkirk and Inverness, Highland drovers brought their herds to market, meeting Lowland buyers face to face. By the 16th century, the black cattle trade had become central to Highland economic life, with as many as 100,000 animals making their way south annually. Burgh merchants and noble landlords earned vast profits, while Lowlanders became familiar with Highland produce. Goods flowed both ways: wine, ale, cloth, metal tools, and other items not commonly available in the Highlands made their way north. Those Highlanders who learned to speak Scots could rise to positions as middlemen, factors and negotiators in this growing commercial network. Despite lowland accusations of backwardness, the two regions were entwined. Economic necessity bred cooperation. Occasionally, strategic marriages between noble Highland and Lowland families were arranged to seal political agreements or end long-running disputes. King James IV himself took part in such efforts, organising matches between loyal supporters and formerly rebellious clans. Notably, in 1503 he granted the lordship of the Isles to the chief of Clan Campbell, a loyalist, who became the first Earl of Argyll through marriage to a royal kinswoman. These marital alliances, though far from erasing cultural divisions, created channels of communication and influence between the two realms. And so, even as the Highland-Lowland divide endured, the divide remained one of Scotland's most enduring societal rifts in the centuries that followed. The Gaelic-speaking North would undergo military occupation, relentless suppression of its language and traditions, and the profound dislocation of the Highland clearances. And yet, throughout it all, the Highlands managed to preserve a proud and distinct identity, one grounded in familial clans, resourcefulness, and community spirit. Though marked by struggle and scarcity, this region became a refuge for ancestral lore, oral tradition, and a fierce independence that refused to yield. Even now, the echoes of Scotland's Highland schism are woven into the nation's language, politics, place names, and sense of self. Surnames, tartans, and romantic imagery of the Highlands stir a deep emotional response, not only among Scots but also across the widespread global diaspora. That ancient cultural divide left behind both wounds and a resilient duality, anchoring a richer understanding of what it truly means to be Scottish. It stands as a lasting testament to the complex history that has shaped this resilient nation at the rugged fringe of Europe. But hardship for medieval Scots did not only arise from within their own land. In 1350 they were visited by a force as invisible as it was unstoppable, the Black Death. This dreadful plague, which had already swept through much of the continent, crept ashore in Scottish ports aboard merchant ships and quickly began to ravage the land. Contemporary accounts evoke a scene of horror and despair. John of Fordun noted that nearly 1/3 of humanity was wiped out, and that the Scots, fearing the end was near, gave up daily life to await their fate, bodies overwhelmed burial efforts, lying in the open streets. Victims often succumbed within days of the first painful swellings, dark buboes appearing beneath their arms or at their necks. The disease paid no heed to social rank or geography. It struck both Highlander and Lowlander, noble and serf alike, carried by fleas that thrived in the cramped, unsanitary dwellings of towns and monasteries. In remote rural villages, the infection devastated whole communities as farmers handling contaminated animals fell sick. Families vanished entirely, and the survivors wandered in stunned silence through the wreckage of their world. One haunting tale speaks of Sir William Douglas, the Knight of Liddesdale and protector of young King David II. As the plague tore through his lands in 1353, he withdrew to a remote location so as not to endanger others. There, in solitude, he awaited death with quiet acceptance. Even the bravest hearts were gripped by fear when faced with such an incomprehensible foe. Many interpreted the catastrophe as divine punishment for human sin. Bands of penitents scourged themselves in public acts of contrition, hoping to appease a wrathful God. While Jewish communities across Europe were targeted with deadly pogroms, Scotland largely avoided such violence. Still, most could do little but pray for mercy and turn to the church for what limited solace it could offer. Towns and countryside, emptied by death, would take decades to recover. And the plague was not finished. Scotland endured wave after wave of outbreaks, returning with grim regularity through the late medieval era. New surges in 1361, 1362, 1380 and 1392 claimed thousands more lives and kept fear alive in every corner of the realm. The consequences were staggering. With so many labourers dead, crops went unharvested, and entire parishes lay without clergy. Churches fell silent, missing priests to perform last rites. The plague so disrupted inheritance that vast swaths of land changed hands. Heirs took possession of estates left by the dead, debtors slipped from obligation, and tenant farmers gained leverage in negotiating rents as lords vied for scarce labour. The horror of the disease was perhaps most vivid in the harsh strategies employed to contain it. Once infection was confirmed, afflicted households were sealed shut, their doors painted with white crosses, and families were left to die together. The homes of the deceased were burned, and their belongings destroyed. Mass graves swallowed victims without ritual or remembrance. Entire neighbourhoods were quarantined. Travellers and ships from plague-stricken regions were turned away or detained. Guards were stationed to prevent the sick from escaping into healthier areas. In a time that knew nothing of bacteria or hygiene, these grim procedures offered little more than desperation wrapped in ritual. And yet, they speak to the terror and helplessness that gripped a nation standing against an unseen killer. These basic responses were all the authorities could offer, yet they likely worsened the tragedy by trapping the healthy inside with the sick. The arrival of the plague stirred a grim devotion in those who now lived under death's constant gaze. The Scots made preparations for the end by writing wills and donating funds for prayers, hoping these would hasten their souls through purgatory. Processions carrying sacred relics wound their way through narrow streets, intended to shield communities from the disease's malice. A chilling image, the dance of death, emerged in paintings and poetry, a sombre reminder of how fleeting life had become. In time, both Scotland and the broader continent began to emerge from the shadow of the Black Death, though its echoing consequences would linger for generations. The massive loss of life strangely brought some benefits for those who survived: increased wages, upward mobility, and the slow erosion of serfdom. Still, its emotional and spiritual toll is hard to exaggerate. The plague ushered in a grim new era, one steeped in dread and disillusionment, where death was ever near and life felt more fragile than ever before. As Scotland slowly climbed out of this dreadful abyss, it did so changed, reshaped by sorrow and mortality. Bustling towns had fallen silent, families were splintered, old assumptions had collapsed. Bit by bit, the people began restoring their broken institutions and communal bonds. But none who had endured those years would ever forget what they had witnessed. The randomness of fate, the brutality of loss, these became part of the country's collective soul. To this day, folk songs and mournful ballads recall the foul death of the English that swept across the land. Place names like Sick Man's Acre or Windy Galls mark sites of mass graves, quiet tributes to past horror. Rituals emerged in rural areas, invoking saints to guard against illness. And the memory of the pestilence coloured the spiritual upheavals that would follow in later centuries. Even as the nation was racked by religious transformations and prophetic visions, the Scots dug deep into their long-standing reserves of strength and belief, as they had always done when tested. Theirs became a culture refined through hardship and deeply aware of life's impermanence. The country that managed to rebuild in the wake of the Black Death bore deep scars. Yet it was also held together by stubborn hope, a refusal to surrender in a world that could seem senseless and harsh. Now we turn our thoughts northward once more, back to the Highlands, where the clans continued shaping a legacy that would define Scotland for ages to come. For centuries, Highland warriors had challenged the authority of Scottish kings, yet they had also defended the land from foreign threats. Their fierce loyalty to kin over crown, and their unyielding defence of ancestral lands brought both chaos and resilience to the realm. Central to this Highland society was the clan, an intricate kinship network. In Gaelic, clan meant children, and this was no mere metaphor. These extended families traced their lineage to a shared forebear, to whom they all owed loyalty. At the head of every clan stood the chief, the Sean Sinead, or head of the kin, a figure part monarch, part protector. He commanded the respect and allegiance of his people in return for justice and safety. Typically, leadership passed through the male line to the eldest son or to a designated second-in-command called the Tanist, though there were notable exceptions. The MacLeods of Dunvegan, for instance, preserved their leadership line through daughters across several generations. Branches of larger clans often fought one another for the right to lead. This was true of the MacDonalds during the 15th century, when rival lines, such as the MacIans of Ardnamurchan and the MacDonalds of Lochs, clashed over the forfeited lordship of the Isles. In the Highlands, to live without a clan meant being stripped of identity, kinship, and safety in a dangerous world. These family ties were the threads that wove together the social fabric and maintained structure within this warrior society. Each clan was subdivided into septs and branches, each with its own captains and roles. Beneath the chiefs were officers known as tacksmen, and lesser noblemen who acted as local leaders over groups of clansmen. At the base were tenant farmers who worked the land held by their clan. Serving one's chief stood above all other duties. It outweighed obligations to church or king. Clansmen gave tribute in the form of livestock, grain, and labour, and when called they gathered to settle feuds or to raid neighbouring lands. The prospect of a glorious death in service to one's kin and ancestral honour was the highest aspiration for young warriors steeped in the heroic ethos of Gaelic war poetry and clan law. By necessity, each clan was a miniature martial state, with its own fighting force ready to be mobilised at a moment's notice. Highland chiefs presided over a society that was perpetually on a war footing, with young boys trained from an early age in weapons and warrior codes. Every man was expected to bear arms and defend clan territory against rivals and interlopers. Cattle raiding was a rite of passage that honed skills while paying back affront to clan honour. This culture of hyper-vigilance and militancy arose from the brutal realities of Highland geography and politics. The clan lands were remote, rugged and thinly peopled, a patchwork of mist-shrouded glens. Lochs and bens divided by mountains and the sea. Clans jealously guarded ancestral holdings and grazing lands, their borders in a constant state of flux amid the churn of raids and feuds. Woe to the clan that failed to protect its own countless feuds. Large and small convulsed the clans, some dragging on for generations in a relentless cycle of retribution. One of the longest and bloodiest was the feud between the Campbell and the MacDonalds, two sprawling confederacies vying for supremacy in the Western Highlands. Their enmity reached a horrific climax in 1692 with the massacre of Gleno, when Campbell government troops slaughtered their MacDonald hosts in a shocking breach of hospitality. The clan's martial prowess and stubborn autonomy long frustrated the designs of Scottish kings to impose central authority in the Highlands monarchs from James I to James V VI, struggled to curb the reivers' depredations, and the chiefs' might makes right ethos. They planted burghs and sheriffdoms as toeholds of land. Law in the gate hell. but as long as clansmen obeyed their chief's first royal writ would run thin in the hills. This was a lesson the Stuart kings learned the hard way as they tried to tame their Gaelic frontier. James IV, eager to play the great reconciler, made a much publicised visit to the Isles in 1493 to accept the submission of the recalcitrant chiefs. He came away with hostages and pledges of loyalty, but as soon as his Berlin receded over the horizon, the chiefs promptly returned to their reaving ways, with scarcely a backward glance. James V took a harder line, mounting punitive raids into the Highlands to make the rush bush keep the cow, as one chronicle put it in 1540. He sailed around the Isles with a naval force descending on the surprised M'Leods of Dunvegan and MacDonalds of Dunneville to ring out pledges of obedience. The short-lived result spoke to the limits of coercive action against a deeply rooted clan structure. The king scarcely understood, not until after the Reformation during the reign of James V, VI, would the Highlands face a truly concerted campaign to break the unreasoned barbarity and contempt of the chiefs. As the king railed the statutes of Iona in 6009 imposed draconian anglicising measures, banning Gaelic poets and bards, mandating Protestant education for chiefly heirs, prescribing private wars. A new era of civilising the clans by obliterating their native culture was in the offing. Yet, for all the outrage it stirred in Edinburgh, the untamed martial vigour of the continuing the script for centuries. The clans were the backbone of Scottish society, providing identity protection and fierce loyalty in a dangerous and divided land. To be born into a clan was to be born into a tight-knit community bound by blood and honour, where the bonds of kinship mattered more than any distant king. But it also meant inheriting generations-old feuds and rivalries as clans jostled for power, land and vengeance. Take the bitter enmity between Clan Campbell and Clan MacDonald, two of the most powerful families in the West Highlands. Their feud stretched back to the 13th century when a Campbell chief murdered the head of the MacDonalds and stole his lands from that bloody original sin. An endless cycle of raids, murders and kidnappings erupted between the two clans in 1297. The MacDonalds seized their chance for revenge when they ambushed and slaughtered the Campbell chief and his escort, but the score was far from. The dream of achieving a noble death in service of kin and ancestral pride remained the ultimate goal for many young warriors, shaped by the values of Gaelic battle songs and clan tradition. Each clan, by necessity, functioned as a miniature military state, maintaining its own band of fighters always prepared to mobilise. Highland chieftains oversaw a community that lived in constant readiness for conflict, where young lads were trained early in weaponry and codes of honour. Every adult male bore the expectation to carry arms and defend their lands from rivals or outsiders. Raiding cattle became a rite of passage, a test of courage and skill, while also serving to restore damaged clan pride. This ever-alert warlike society emerged from the unforgiving nature of Highland life, both geographically and politically. The region was a vast and rugged expanse, mist-laced glens, winding lochs, mountain ranges, and scattered settlements carved from stone. Within this harsh landscape, clans clung tightly to their grazing rights and territories, with borders ever shifting in the chaos of conflict. To leave one's people unguarded invited disaster. Countless hostilities, from small-scale skirmishes to all-out bloodshed, tore through the Highlands. Some feuds lasted for centuries, sustained by a relentless pursuit of vengeance. Among the most infamous was the long-standing rivalry between Clan Campbell and Clan MacDonald, two formidable lineages fighting for dominance in the Western Highlands. That bitter conflict reached a terrifying peak in 1692 during the Glencoe massacre, when government troops under Campbell command murdered their MacDonald hosts, shattering the sacred code of Highland hospitality. The martial strength and fierce independence of these clans had long thwarted royal ambitions to impose unified rule. Kings from James V to James VI wrestled with how to contain the Highlands' relentless raiding and the chiefs' raw authority. Efforts to introduce sheriffs and burghs, symbols of law and governance, often faltered in a land where chieftains reigned supreme and royal decrees carried little weight. The Stuarts learned time and again how fragile their grasp was beyond the lowland borders. James IV, hoping to mend old wounds, famously journeyed to the Isles in 1493, accepting oaths of fealty and taking hostages from rebellious chiefs. Yet no sooner had his sails disappeared than the clans resumed their age-old customs without hesitation. His son James V adopted a harsher approach, launching punitive expeditions into the north in an effort to make the rush bush keep the cow, as one chronicler noted. In 1540 he led a naval fleet around the Hebrides, appearing suddenly before the surprised MacLeods of Dunvegan and the MacDonalds of Dunyveg, forcing pledges of loyalty from them both. The temporary gains of such shows of force, however, revealed the limitations of relying on military strength alone to tame a deeply rooted and complex clan order. Real transformation would not come until after the Protestant Reformation, under James VI, when a more systematic effort began to dismantle the old Gaelic ways. To that end, the Statutes of Iona, enacted in 1609, imposed sweeping reforms. Gaelic bards and poets were outlawed. Clan heirs were required to study English and Protestantism, and private wars were formally prohibited. A new chapter had opened, one defined by attempts to civilise the Highlands by erasing its cultural core. Yet despite the storm of protests echoing through Edinburgh, the raw strength and warrior pride of the Highland clans endured. For generations, these clans had been the lifeblood of Scotland's most volatile regions, embodying loyalty, identity, and protection in a land divided by war and hardship. To be born into a clan meant joining a tight-knit network governed by blood ties and a deep sense of duty, where loyalty to kin mattered far more than any allegiance to a distant crown. But such bonds came with a legacy of inherited animosities, as ancient disputes over land, honour, and power passed from one generation to the next. Consider again the fierce rivalry between the Campbells and the MacDonalds, towering clans of the West Highlands. Their animosity began in the 13th century with a brutal betrayal. A Campbell chief murdered the MacDonald leader and seized his lands. That act, soaked in treachery, sparked an endless pattern of revenge, raids, killings, and the taking of hostages. In 1297, the MacDonalds struck back with ferocity, ambushing the Campbell chief and his guards, cutting them down in a storm of retribution. But the feud was far from resolved. Over the course of 4 long centuries, the blood feud continued to fester, leaving deep scars across generations. In 1646, the Campbells slaughtered MacDonalds inside their own homes. Then came the retaliatory killing of Campbell clansmen by MacDonalds in a snow-blanketed glen in 1692. Countless other brutal incidents unfolded in between, far too many to recount. Neither family stood blameless, both locked in an endless battle of revenge and power. They were hardly alone. Other clans too engaged in ruthless vendettas. The Mackenzies clashed with the MacLeods, the Grants with the Gordons, and the MacGregors with the Colquhouns. Across the Highlands and scattered isles, bitter rivalries brewed beneath the surface, constantly shifting with alliances forged, then shattered, as clans manoeuvred for the upper hand. One year brothers and cousins might unite to fight a common enemy. The next, they could find themselves on opposing sides as loyalties changed. This relentless cycle spared no aspect of Highland life. Women were abducted, sometimes to forge alliances through forced marriages, other times to secure leverage as hostages. Children were raised on stories of ancient enemies, learning early that their path would one day lead to the battlefield. Chiefs sent raiding parties to steal cattle, to sustain their people and starve their foes. A harsh necessity in lean seasons. When the burning cross or fiery cross passed from hamlet to hamlet, loyal clansmen dropped whatever task they held and prepared for battle. To modern minds it may seem savage, but in the Gaelic world of the clans, this life was not only accepted, it was honoured. A man's worth was measured by his courage, his skill in combat, and above all, his unwavering loyalty to his people. Turning one's back on the clan was beyond shameful, and the noblest path of all was to fall in defence of one's kin, to avenge old wounds and earn eternal glory in the songs of the clan. Yet this same clan structure, for all its pride and power, left Scotland fractured, an easy target for manipulative forces beyond the glens. Kings in Edinburgh and later in London found ways to exploit these rivalries. By granting titles and lands to preferred chiefs, they stoked the fires of jealousy and discord, deepening clan divides. Through the dreaded letters of fire and sword, monarchs handed trusted clans legal permission to decimate their neighbours. Imagine the constant fear, knowing your peaceful morning could end with your home in flames, your livestock gone, your father or brother cut down in the dark. Justice from the crown rarely ventured into the Highland wilds. The only hope for survival lay in the strength and cunning of the local chief. For the ordinary folk, the farmers, the shepherds, those who vastly outnumbered the warriors, the cost was immense. While clan leaders and fighters bathed in the glory of raids and victories, it was the humble people who bore the brunt of the devastation. Fields were scorched, homes were lost, and lives uprooted again and again. And even far from the battlefield, there was no respite from the punishing grind of life. During William Wallace's rebellion in 1997, a Scottish peasant could expect a lifespan of just 24 years. Reaching the age of 45 would have been a rare stroke of fortune. Though by then, arthritis and exhaustion would have already carved deep lines into their frame. From the moment a boy's fingers could wrap around a hoe, he was thrust into the chief's fields. There he toiled endlessly, trying to coax a harvest from the rocky highland soil. Oats and barley were often all that could grow in such wet, poor earth, leaving little variety on the table. Oatcakes, porridge, and thin ale to avoid the tainted water. Meat? Only when a sickly lamb or weakened calf had to be culled. As for the girls, their lives were no gentler. Long before the first rays of dawn, they were already up, milking the clan's few sheep or cows, their hands raw and aching from the highland cold. In the chill of morning, if a girl was deemed fair enough, she might catch the gaze of a young clansman and be wed off once she reached age, her dowry paid in cattle to her father. Yet any fleeting dreams of romance were quickly dashed by the grueling truth of raising children inside a cramped turf-walled hut, her body bearing child after child with scarcely a pause between. Even the relative comfort of the chief's thatched manor brought little relief from the endless tasks of feeding and clothing the clan. While the men ventured off to raid or settle feuds, the burden of managing the estate fell upon the chief's wife. By dim candlelight, her tired eyes strained as she wove coarse wool into garments late into the night. There was always the gnawing worry that rival clans would strike beneath the cover of darkness, setting fire to the stored grain and slaughtering the household staff as they slept. Yet, the deadliest threat that loomed over every Scottish family was not sword or spear, but sickness. Disease stalked the glens like a shadow. The Black Death, having first swept through Scotland in 1350, had extinguished nearly a third of all lives. It struck without warning. Grotesque swellings in groin and armpit, blackened vomit, and bodies that collapsed before help could arrive. Villages were abandoned as terrified survivors scattered to escape its reach. Though its initial wave had passed, the plague's shadow lingered. Measles, tuberculosis, dysentery. Each in turn devastated peasant homes where remedies were scarce. Lepers were cast out to live and die alone, their bodies wasting away. Infants, heartbreakingly vulnerable, perished in large numbers. More than half never living to see their 5th year. For a mother to bury yet another small, withered child, stifling her sobs while a priest murmured prayers over the crude grave, was a sorrow too heavy to carry. Church teachings offered little comfort, often insisting such loss was divine punishment, the price of sins hidden in every human soul. A devout woman could only cling to the hope that her suffering would be redeemed in the world beyond. This yearning for salvation gave the powerful Catholic Church its unshakable hold over the Highland people. In a world shaped by grief and hardship, the Church stood as a beacon of continuity, its towering abbeys and cathedrals rising above the sod huts of the poor, offering a glimpse of heaven on earth. But that splendour came at a cost. The Church's hunger for wealth was relentless. Its taxes and tithes stripped the peasants of what little they had. 1/10 of every harvest belonged to the bishop or abbot, demanded under the threat of eternal damnation. Even during famine, when children's bellies swelled from hunger, the granaries of the church overflowed. To question church doctrine was to risk death. Heretics were executed, strangled and burned before crowds, their fate a grim warning to all. People lived in dread of unknowingly committing offences against heaven. A priest's judgment could doom a woman as a witch, especially those who lived alone, practiced healing, or assisted in childbirth. Spurned lovers or jealous neighbours might speak a single word, and the flames would follow. The methods of extracting confessions were cruel and calculated. Screws crushed fingers, boots boiled oil against skin. The dreaded Iron Maiden awaited, its interior lined with sharpened spikes. Few withstood such torment. Most would say anything to make it stop, even if it meant condemning themselves. Yet despite the cruelty, the church remained a rare source of knowledge and compassion. Within monastic walls, devoted monks preserved sacred texts by hand, safeguarding history for future generations. Gentle nuns gave shelter to orphans, tended to the sick, and offered final comfort to the dying. On holy feast days, even the poorest might witness the glory of the Mass. The soaring hymns in Latin, the glittering robes of the clergy. A vision of beauty otherwise unknown. Such was the contradiction at the heart of Scottish religious life. A church capable of both mercy and tyranny, of lifting the soul and filling it with dread. For both lowly peasant and noble chief, its authority was supreme, a divine constant in a world of hunger and unrest. Even monarchs were not beyond its reach, as the devout English Queen Margaret would come to understand during her reign as the Scottish king's wife. Margaret, the devoted wife of Malcolm III, made it her life's work to reform the lenient traditions of the Celtic abbeys and align them more closely with Rome. She funded splendid churches, brought sacred relics to hallow the land, and showered gold upon the clergy to secure their allegiance. But she was far from a passive figure, quietly sewing altar cloths in silence. She used her devoutness as a tool, compelling the Scottish bishops to acknowledge her royal authority. Under her command, the Grand Abbey of Dunfermline rose from the earth, its soaring arches and graceful nave a reflection of her power. Upon her death, her grieving husband laid her to rest with the grandeur and reverence worthy of a saint. Yet, even Queen Margaret's intense devotion could not mend the wounds that divided Scotland's fractious clans. As the years turned and the wars dragged on, the suffering of ordinary people only deepened. During the late 1200s, King Edward I of England, known as Longshanks, launched a merciless campaign to subjugate Scotland. His soldiers destroyed abbeys and villages alike. Some clan leaders, hoping to preserve their land and status, swore fealty to Edward in return for titles. But others, like William Wallace and Andrew Moray, refused to yield, summoning their kinsmen to fight a guerrilla war in the Highland fog. At Stirling Bridge in 1997, Highland warriors, armed only with pikes and broadswords, overwhelmed Edward's heavily armoured knights. But Wallace's courageous rebellion ended in heartbreak. Betrayed by his own nobles, he was captured, shackled, and hauled to London. His trial was nothing more than ceremony, the verdict already decided. For defying a king, the punishment was as brutal as the age itself, hanged, drawn, and quartered, his severed head displayed as a warning to others. Wallace's horrific end, rather than silencing resistance, inflamed it. Those who had lost families and homes to English cruelty rose to honour his name. In 1314 at Bannockburn, Robert the Bruce's forces, many clad in rags, faced the full might of English chivalry. Yet the tightly packed schiltrons of spearmen held the line, their long pikes cutting down knight and horse alike. Against all odds, the Scots triumphed, securing a precious, hard-won freedom. But that victory came at a dreadful cost. Across the land, fields lay barren and blackened, the air still heavy with ash. Entire clans had been erased, villages were burnt to the ground, thousands perished, and famine stalked the survivors. Those who remained scraped by on whatever meagre remnants they could salvage. Hollow eyes and thin limbs spoke of years without food. Even in triumph, Scotland bore the deep wounds of war, scars that would linger for generations. And yet, through this long season of sorrow and violence, the clans endured. In the face of hunger that gnawed at their bellies, winters that chilled them to the bone, and the heartbreak of burying their own children, they carried on. They patched together ruined homes, returned to their ravaged fields, and raised what family they had left. These were the unsung pillars of Scotland's story, not the proud warrior chiefs or the power-hungry nobles, but the humble people who quietly refused to break. Their courage was not loud or glorious, but it endured. Without their determination, there would be no Scotland to speak of today. So when travellers gaze upon a ruined clan stronghold, or the arched nave of a forgotten abbey, may they remember those nameless souls who laid the stones. Their identities may be lost to time, but their legacy pulses in the land itself, in the thistle pushing through rocky earth, in the mournful wail of bagpipes carried by highland winds, and in the unyielding spirit of a people forged by fire. In our modern lives, filled with comfort and ease, it becomes easy to overlook what those before us endured, and what they sacrificed for the freedoms we now enjoy. But forgetting their pain would be a mistake. For within the very marrow of every Scot runs the memory of a time when life was harsh and fleeting, death a shadow that followed every step. And still in that bleakness they endured. A people hammered in darkness, shaped not just by suffering, but by stubborn hope. Their refusal to yield, even in the face of impossible odds, remains one of their most enduring legacies. So let them be remembered not as myth or ballad might simplify them, but as they truly were, a people proud, headstrong, and often quarrelsome, with every flaw and frailty found in any human community. Yet within them lived a remarkable toughness, a quiet, stubborn resilience that withstood the unthinkable. They bore heavy burdens, and still they endured. In their trials we may glimpse strength for our own, though ours may be far smaller by comparison. For if generations of Scots could pass through fire, through hunger, through plague, through wars without end, and still cling fiercely to their spirit and sense of self, then surely we can face our own storms and press on. And in that remembering, we might pause to feel gratitude for the quiet gifts we too easily overlook: a warm room, a full meal, the closeness of family, the stillness of safety. These humble comforts were won for us, not easily, not cheaply, but through blood, hardship, and sacrifice. We honour their memory best by recognising their legacy in our lives. So let them be toasted, these Scots of old, with all the reverence they deserve, for the grit that carried them through history's darkest hours. May the flame of their story continue to glow, casting light for those of us still walking in uncertain times. And may those of us who come after, their children's children, never forget what they paid so dearly for us to inherit. In truth, it is not the castles or crowns that define the true legacy of medieval Scotland, not the endless battles or the storied feuds. Rather, it is the bond, unshaken and forged in pain, that held the people together. A shared endurance that still connects us across time, reaching back to the very blood and bone that shaped who we are. A lineage of courage and identity that belongs to each of us born under Scotland's sky. And so, as sleep gently claims the mind, let it carry them into dreams, those long ago days when life was unforgiving and rough, yet still laced with moments of grace. Let them walk the mist-veiled moors in silence, accompanied by the ghosts of their kin. Let them hear echoes of joy and grief in the wind, and give quiet thanks for what was given, and what was lost, so that they might live in a better world than their forebears ever imagined. For in the end, that is what matters most. The silent gratitude of a people who remember, who carry the memory forward. A memory that lives as long as there are hands to tend the fire and hearts to pass it on. And so, friends, rest well. Drift into gentle dreams of Scotland as it once was. Let those dreams bring comfort and strength for the days ahead. Let them honour the tenacity of those who came before, the quiet, brave souls whose lives made possible our own. Sleep in peace and let Scotland hold them close. As time moved on, the story of Scotland deepened. The Stuart line continued, and with it came growing ties to England. A turning point arrived in 1503, when King James IV of Scotland wed Margaret Tudor, daughter of England's King Henry VII. Their marriage was more than a royal match. It planted the seeds of a future union between the two crowns. Though no one at the time could see what lay ahead, this bond would echo down the centuries. James and Margaret were a study in contrasts. He, a Renaissance prince, learned, bold, a patron of science and art, yet a warrior king as well. She, elegant and cultured, a product of the refined Tudor court. Together they brought a sense of polish and brightness to Scotland's court. The days of struggle for the Stuart throne seemed a thing of the past. Confidence took root, and dreams of a golden age emerged. Under James IV, Scotland experienced a brief but notable period of peace and progress. He forged a truce with England, opening new doors for trade. A lover of the sea, he commissioned mighty vessels. none grander than the Great Michael, one of the era's most formidable warships. Yet such seasons of prosperity rarely last. In 1513, bound by Scotland's ancient alliance with France, James honoured the bond and marched to war. At the disastrous Battle of Flodden, the flower of Scottish nobility perished at the hands of the English, and James himself fell amidst the thickest of the fray. It marked a devastating moment for Scotland, one that would leave lasting scars, taking many years for the nation to heal. Margaret, now widowed and with a young son, assumed the regency for James V. Yet, not everyone welcomed this English-born queen as ruler. Before long, the Duke of Albany, next in line for the throne, seized control. Throughout these years of upheaval, young James grew up surrounded by intrigue, as factions battled for influence. Following Albany, Margaret's second husband, the ambitious Earl of Angus, stepped into power. Amid this chaos, James V eventually emerged as a resolute and shrewd monarch, determined to break free from the shadow of the powerful Douglas family into which his mother had married. Much like his father, James aimed to strengthen royal control and diminish the might of the great Scottish lords. In 1528, he delivered a crushing blow to the Douglases, affirming his authority across the kingdom. James also stood firm against his uncle, King Henry VIII of England, who tried to sway Scottish politics and pressure them to abandon the Catholic Church. This stance would carry weighty consequences. Desperate to produce a male heir, James first married the gentle French noblewoman, Madeleine of Valois, who sadly passed away just weeks after arriving in Scotland. His second marriage was to the formidable Mary of Guise, who would bear him a daughter in 1542. Mary, who would later be known as the ill-fated Queen of Scots. But James would never live to see his daughter's future unfold. Later that year, Scottish forces endured a crushing defeat by the English at Solway Moss. The loss shattered James's spirit, and not long afterward he passed away, only 30 years old. Once again, Scotland was led by an infant ruler and a foreign-born Queen Mother serving as regent. This period of uncertainty aligned with the sweeping tide of the Protestant Reformation, making its way through Europe. Mary of Guise fought to keep Scotland within the Catholic fold and in alliance with France, while the English sought to impose Protestantism and draw Scotland into their orbit. Reformers like John Knox railed against what they viewed as corrupt French influence over the Scottish court. Tensions simmered until, in 1559, they erupted into open conflict. Caught between powerful nations and divided internally by faith and loyalty, the Scottish people faced unending instability. Villages were plundered and destroyed, regardless of whether they backed the English-supported Protestant lords of the congregation or the French-aligned Catholic regime. The scale of devastation during these conflicts rivaled the earlier wars of independence. After more than 10 years of intermittent civil war, the Protestant cause triumphed, and in 1560 Scotland officially severed ties with the Catholic Church. Still, healing the wounds of religious division would prove a long and painful process. More unrest followed. Mary, Queen of Scots, was deposed in 1567, and a series of regencies governed in her place. Eventually her son, James VI of Scotland, ascended to the English throne in 1603, uniting the crowns of two once warring kingdoms. Throughout all the high-level power struggles, dynastic disputes, and shifting religious allegiances, it was the ordinary Scots who bore the weight of it all. Whether in the highlands or lowlands, whether Catholic or Protestant, the people endured the consequences of decisions made by nobles and kings. For them, life was shaped not by court politics, but by the harshness of daily survival, by hard labour, poor harvests, sickness, and sorrow. The peace of James IV's reign must have felt like a distant dream as they faced famine, war, and persecution under the rule of his descendants. Yet still they endured. Just as their ancestors had before them, they weathered each storm with the same quiet strength that had seen Scotland through centuries of trial. And as the 16th century came to a close, no one could foresee the even greater transformation awaiting them. With the 1707 Acts of Union on the horizon, Scotland, independent for over 800 years, was poised to enter a new and uncertain era. This nation had survived Viking raids, civil wars, dynastic battles, and the fires of religious reform. And though they didn't yet know what lay ahead, the people of Scotland were on the verge of writing a new chapter in their long and remarkable story. But those tales belong to another evening. For now let them rest, let the mists close gently over the past, and may the memory of their resilience linger like a song on the wind. They left medieval Scotland behind and allowed themselves to drift gently into sleep, their thoughts filled with images of mist-covered glens and ancient stone fortresses, of fierce clansmen and devout monks, of sovereign kings and queens, and of the everyday folk who bore the burdens beneath them. Together they had followed the Scots through centuries of hardship and perseverance, through cold, conflict and faith, in a land that was as breathtaking as it was unforgiving. And now as they returned to their present-day comforts, perhaps a deeper appreciation stirred within them for all that had been endured to shape the Scotland they knew today. Rest well, and sleep in peace. Here begins the continuation of the story, why life was harsh and unrelenting in medieval Scotland. The Catholic Church wielded tremendous power, standing firmly alongside the mightiest clan chieftains in both spiritual and worldly affairs. Its influence permeated every layer of society. Priests and bishops demanded heavy tithes, 10% of all labour's fruits, and pity the soul who dared to oppose the strict rules and decrees of the faith. Pious Queen Margaret, who had journeyed from England to marry King Malcolm III, took it upon herself to reform the Scottish Church. She enforced fasting and penance, forbade clerical marriages, and worked to bring ancient Celtic customs under Roman discipline. Over time, Scotland's church aligned closely with Rome, largely through her efforts. And in the years that followed, the church cracked down harshly on any whispers of heresy. Accusations of witchcraft became frequent. Women suspected of dealings with unholy powers were dragged before ecclesiastical courts, often tortured until they confessed. Some were burned at the stake in grim spectacles meant to frighten the masses. For lesser transgressions, blasphemy, adultery, or disobedience, people were flogged, branded, or confined in stocks for all to see. It was within the thick, cold walls of monasteries and priories that some found brief shelter from the turmoil. There, monks dressed in coarse robes offered fragments of education, and nuns knelt in humble prayer, their chants echoing softly through the stone chapels. Across the land, towering cathedrals like those in St Andrews and Glasgow cast long shadows over the countryside, powerful symbols of divine presence and permanence. But even the authority of the Church trembled when faced with the most brutal era in Scottish history, the Wars of Independence. Since early times, English monarchs had laid claim to supremacy over Scotland. In 1296, Edward I, known as Longshanks, chose to enforce that claim with ruthless force. His armies swept northward, bringing ruin to all who defied his will. The destruction was swift and merciless, farms reduced to ash, entire towns flattened, and thousands slaughtered or left to starve amid the wreckage. Death swept across the land, leaving few untouched. Amid the chaos, a towering figure emerged, William Wallace. Though only the youngest son of a minor noble, his defiance blazed bright. He rose up, leading guerrilla attacks from the forests and rocky slopes, gathering farmers and labourers to strike against the English occupiers. In 1297, at Stirling Bridge, Wallace achieved a remarkable triumph. His small force waited patiently, luring English troops onto the narrow span over the River Forth. At just the right moment, the Scots struck from both sides. English soldiers fell into the current, their heavy armour dragging them down. It was a stunning victory. Still, Wallace's war could not hold back Edward's relentless machine. At Falkirk the following year, the king's longbowmen unleashed their fury. The tightly packed ranks of Scottish spearmen were broken under clouds of arrows. Survivors scattered into the hills. Wallace became a hunted man. Eventually he was captured in 1305 and transported to London in chains. His trial, a mere formality, ended with a brutal sentence, to be hanged, drawn and quartered. He was strangled, then revived, only to be disemboweled and mutilated before his executioner's blade delivered its final blow. His severed head was mounted atop London Bridge. His limbs, displayed in four corners of Scotland, his limbs served as a chilling symbol, yet the spirit of Wallace and the fight for Scottish independence lived on. Even in those bleakest years, hope flickered. 8 years later, Robert the Bruce, a rival claimant to the throne, led the Scots to a remarkable victory over the English at Bannockburn in 1314. effectively securing Scotland's independence after nearly 2 decades of relentless conflict. However, the aftermath left the Scottish people in dire straits. Famine and poverty gripped the countryside, where once lush farmland had been reduced to barren stretches of wasted earth. Ironically, it was this long and bloody conflict with England that paved the way for a new ruling dynasty, the Stuarts. Walter Stewart had married Bruce's daughter Marjorie, and their son, Robert II, assumed the throne in 1371. But while the Stuart monarchs revelled in opulence, holding grand banquets and presiding over jousts, their subjects remained mired in hardship and want. Consider King James I, who spent 18 formative years in English captivity from the tender age of 12. Treated more like a noble guest than a hostage, James developed refined tastes for music, verse, and courtly luxury. Upon his return to Scotland, funded by a substantial ransom, James ruled with iron resolve, determined to stamp out rebellion and tighten his grip on power. Yet these early Stuart rulers were plagued by internal strife. The powerful nobles, jealous and fractious, resisted royal authority. James I and James II attempted to centralise rule, but their efforts came at a terrible price. Both were assassinated. James III fared little better, meeting his end in a rebellion led by his own son. Meanwhile, the lives of ordinary folk remained unchanged, defined by endless toil, harsh taxes, and little to no support from the throne. Monarchs like James IV may have been skilled at diplomacy and warfare, but they paid scant attention to improving the lot of the common people. In 1503, James IV married Margaret Tudor, the daughter of England's King Henry VII, a union that, in time, would both inflame future tensions and lay the foundation for a unified crown with England. Yet not even royal splendour could fend off the terror of the Black Death. This catastrophic plague arrived in 1350 like a storm of sorrow, claiming the lives of nearly a third of the Scottish population. Where once lively villages bustled, only hollow ruins remained. Death spared no station, nobles and labourers alike succumbed. Parents were left to bury their own children, mourning amidst rows of fresh graves. Streets grew littered with the darkened corpses of the dead, while the dreaded carts passed through towns to collect them. And the horror did not end there. The plague would return in brutal waves across the centuries, each time ushering in fresh waves of despair. Some turned to self-inflicted suffering, marching through towns as flagellants, their backs torn and bleeding in hopes of divine mercy. But no relief came. Recovery was slow, always interrupted by the next visitation of pestilence. As if these horrors were not enough, the Scottish commoners also endured a deepening cultural rift between the highlands and the lowlands. Though both regions were ruled by the same crown, they could not have been more different. In the rugged highlands, Gaelic culture, clan loyalty, and Celtic heritage endured. Yet lowland Scots, wealthier and more anglicised, viewed their highland cousins with suspicion, portraying them as uncivilised raiders and relics of a bygone age. Disparaging stereotypes flourished. Highlanders were dismissed as painted savages speaking a barbarous tongue. Even as Highland chiefs like the Lords of the Isles wielded quasi-independent power, Lowlanders grew increasingly resentful. This tension only worsened with time, as Highland traditions came under mounting pressure. Still, despite the bitterness, trade and labour bridged the gap. Highland timber and livestock found buyers in the lowlands, and Gaelic warriors often served as hired hands for lowland lairds. The two peoples remained apart in spirit, yet more connected in practice than either would admit. Such was the unforgiving world of medieval Scotland, a patchwork of fractious clans, a domineering church, and a monarchy constantly at odds with its own nobles. It was a land scarred by centuries of war and ravaged by disease, where the average peasant laboured under brutal conditions with little hope of change. Whether caught in clan feuds, burdened by tithes, or fleeing plague, they bore the weight of history on tired shoulders. Of course, that did not mean medieval Scots lived without moments of joy or achievement. They held great pride in a hard day's work done well. They marked marriages, births, and saints' days with celebration. Songs of Wallace and Bruce were sung around hearths, their stories handed down generation after generation. Through it all, they held tightly to an emerging sense of nationhood and a deep-rooted desire for self-rule, even amid hardship. Yet for most, life remained unforgiving, often cruel, brief, and filled with struggle. The echoes of Scotland's medieval suffering still reverberate today. It lingers in the ruins of wind-battered castles that continue to watch over the land. It exists in the dry, sharp wit and the legendary stubbornness of the Scottish people, perhaps cultivated to cope with centuries of adversity. Most of all, it survives in the unshakable identity of a nation that, against all odds, endured oppression and retained its independence. Those of us living in an age of abundance and security can scarcely comprehend the harshness of daily existence in that era. Yet, in looking back with humility and respect, one may better grasp the endurance of the human soul. Scotland's very survival into the modern era owes much to the resolve of its medieval ancestors. Their sacrifices and their steadfast unwillingness to be conquered paved the way for what would become a nation proud and free. For this, a deep and lasting gratitude is owed. As we've uncovered, medieval Scotland was defined by extremes of beauty and bloodshed, resilience and ruin. The Black Death's horrors added to a landscape already torn by conflict and division. Even in peaceful times, a profound rift divided the Gaelic-speaking highlands from the Scots-speaking lowlands. These were two distinct worlds, bound together only by a common monarch. To those in the lowlands, the Highlanders were often seen as primitive and untamed. Their traditions, raiding, cattle thievery and clan warfare, were derided as savage. Highland dress and music felt alien to lowland sensibilities. On the other side, the Highlanders viewed their southern kin as having abandoned their true Scottish roots, growing too close to English ways. This cultural rift was mirrored in the land itself. The lowlands were home to towering cathedrals, bustling royal burghs, and fortified castles. In contrast, the Highlands remained wild and rugged. Clan loyalty mattered more than feudal titles, and ancient customs endured. Narrow glens, mist-veiled lochs and endless moorlands shaped a way of life both harsh and noble, one that kept alive Scotland's deepest Celtic traditions. Bridging this divide stood the Lords of the Isles. Throughout the 1300s and early 1400s, they governed a semi-independent Gaelic realm stretching across the Hebrides and Western Highlands. In many respects, they ruled as monarchs in their own right, guardians of a unique way of life that stood apart from the central authority. And now, greetings once more, fellow nocturnal historians. Before we embark on our journey into the mist-draped moors and crumbling stone towers of medieval Scotland, we'd like to ask a small favour. In the comments below, feel free to share where in the world they're listening from, and what time it is as they tune in. Whether winding down under the London sky, rising early in Sydney, or nestled somewhere in between, all are warmly welcomed here. If these gentle wanderings through distant days bring peace or curiosity, they are invited to subscribe, ensuring they'll never miss another tale from long ago. Now it's time to relax, breathe deeply, and allow the imagination to drift. Let us travel back to a place of raw beauty and harsh truths, a land where bagpipe laments echoed across remote valleys, and claymores clashed in rocky highland passes. The Scotland we know today, with its welcoming locals, snug taverns, and fairy tale scenery, stands atop a past steeped in hardship. Stories of valiant knights and jolly folk may colour the medieval age with a rosy hue. Yet for the Scots, those centuries were shadowed by clan feuds, foreign invasions, a domineering church, and the spectres of disease and hunger. For most, life was not a romantic tale but a daily fight for survival, whether digging in the soil as peasants or navigating the volatile power games of chiefs and monarchs. In the quiet that follows, as sleep approaches, we will gently peel away the legends and songs to glimpse the reality beneath, to feel the pulse of a rugged land, to hear the whisper of its ghosts, and to honour those who lived, loved and endured there. Restful slumber would gently strip away the gloss of legends and ballads, revealing what it truly meant to live, to love, and to fight during such turbulent times. They would come across fierce warriors and devout queens, tread the same paths as ordinary folk scraping out a meagre living, and observe the first sparks of Scotland's rebellious nature sprouting amid unrest. But before all else, let them imagine the setting, a wild, unyielding terrain where mist hugs the lochs, and the breeze whispers through fields of heather. The highlands loom like ancient sentinels, their summits hidden in cloud, their valleys etched by rushing waters. In the lowlands, soft hills roll into rich farmland where tiny villages huddle near humble stone kirks. The air remains cool and brisk, heavy with the scent of peat smoke and damp earth. Dense woods of Scots pine and oak house wild boar and red deer, while eagles wheel overhead, their cries echoing against the vast sky. When night falls, the heavens come alive, stars gleaming clearly in the absence of modern glare. Yet beneath this untamed beauty lies constant peril. Clans nurse grudges and plot vengeance, nobles vie for dominion, and the threat of English incursion lingers ominously. Life for most was an unending effort to endure the climate, illness, and the unpredictable whims of their rulers. They found peace in the repetition of seasons, the closeness of kin and clan, and in the words preached by the church. Here, amid such a backdrop, their story unfolded, a saga of perseverance, belief, and the indomitable will of a people who, despite centuries of adversity, would forge a country. As the journey moves deeper into these stormy times, they would encounter monarchs and peasants, saints and sinners, those crowned as heroes and others reviled as villains, each weaving their own strand into the great tapestry of Scotland's past. But for now, allow the voices of history to fall gently into silence. Let the rustle of leaves, the lowing of distant cattle, and the faint tune of a minstrel's lute lull them to rest. These will be their lullabies tonight, guiding them softly into dreams. Soon the tale shall begin properly. Back in those days, Scotland was not one unified realm, but a mosaic of proud clans, each one fiercely devoted to its own and prepared to protect its name or gain more land at the cost of others. These clans formed the heart of Scottish life, offering identity, safety, and shared heritage in a land where official rule was, at times, barely felt. At a clan's helm stood the chief, held in awe and reverence. Part judge, part warrior, part patriarch, he bore the duty of keeping order, dispensing justice, and leading his warriors into combat, whether against neighbouring clans or outside invaders. Devotion to the clan often surpassed loyalty to the king, especially in a realm where the monarchy's grip was uncertain. Ties of kinship, rather than legal codes, were the glue of community. A man's promise was sacred, and breaking it, or betraying his own people, invited disgrace, banishment, or even death. Yet this intense sense of clan honour brought with it a darker consequence, feuds that ignited over slights, disputes, or thefts, and could spiral into violence lasting generations. One of the most infamous blood feuds was that between Clan Campbell and Clan MacDonald, two dominant lineages of Western Scotland. For ages they clashed over land, influence, and pride. Their rivalry, steeped in ancient grievances, was handed down like a curse through each new generation. Its roots stretched back to the early 1300s, when King Robert the Bruce rewarded the Campbells with land in Argyll for aiding him during the Wars of Independence. To the MacDonalds, who long claimed dominion over that land, this act was a deep insult and a violation of ancestral rights. As decades passed, the animosity between them escalated into outright warfare. Settlements were torched, resources plundered, and rivals slain with calculated cruelty. The grimmest chapter came in 1646, when Campbell forces, under government orders, launched a deadly night raid and slaughtered scores of MacDonald men, women, and children while they slept peacefully in their beds. Homes in Gleno, this tragic event, later known as the Massacre of Gleno, would forever remain a rallying cry for the MacDonalds and a lasting mark of dishonour for the Campbells. The brutal bloodshed only deepened the centuries-long feud between the two clans, a hatred passed down through generations like a bitter legacy. It also illustrated how clan loyalties were often exploited by external powers, particularly the English government, who used divide-and-rule tactics to destabilise and control the Highlands by stirring clan rivalries. For ordinary villagers caught in the crossfire of these conflicts, life became a daily struggle for survival. At any moment, a rival clan might descend upon their settlement, torch their fields, seize livestock, and leave a wake of destruction and death. Families lived in a state of anxious uncertainty, never knowing when they might be called upon to defend their clan's name and honour. Yet amidst this ever-present danger, the clan system still offered a vital sense of belonging. To be a member of a clan was to hold a place in a vast intergenerational lineage. A bond of kinship that provided protection, pride, and continuity. This fierce devotion to one's own people would go on to shape Scotland's destiny in profound ways. While such loyalty fueled long-lasting conflicts that splintered the nation, it also forged the resilience that helped its people endure relentless hardship. Still, clan chiefs and their warriors were not the only ones living and dying by the sword. For the bulk of the population, the peasants, labourers and tradespeople who formed the foundation of medieval society. Existence was a ceaseless grind marked by hardship, illness and inequality. From the moment they could walk, children of the lower classes were set to work. They tended crops and watched over animals from dawn until dusk, internalizing early the harsh lesson that life would offer little reward beyond servitude to distant lords. As they aged, the burdens only increased. Men spent long days ploughing, herding, or harvesting peat to warm their homes. Their bodies wore down from years of labour, bones and joints stiffening with pain. Women laboured just as hard, if not harder, working beside their husbands in the fields, raising children, cooking meals, and maintaining the household even during pregnancy. In the dark, damp mines and stone quarries, workers hacked at the earth using rudimentary tools, hauling coal and stone to the surface in punishing conditions. Accidents were tragically common: cave-ins, toxic fumes, explosions. Many never made it out. Others slowly succumbed to the suffocating effects of lung diseases. For those who managed to survive, comfort was scarce. Most peasant families lived in small, smoky huts, often sharing their cramped quarters with livestock to preserve warmth in the freezing Scottish winters. Their diets were sparse, built mostly around oats, barley, and hardy vegetables grown in stony, unyielding soil. If they were fortunate, they might occasionally have access to scraps of meat or a piece of salted fish. But hunger was a constant shadow. During wartime or poor harvests, starvation loomed large. Crops were stolen or destroyed by raiders, animals driven off or slaughtered. In the most desperate times, some resorted to eating bark, grass, or clay, just to quiet the pangs in their stomachs. Diseases too stalked these fragile communities. With no knowledge of modern medicine, even minor infections could turn fatal. Outbreaks of typhoid, smallpox, and plague would tear through entire villages, leaving trails of devastation. The infamous Black Death in particular returned again and again across generations, compounding the misery. Still, amid these trials, moments of happiness could be found. They celebrated the harvest and the seasons with communal festivals. Music from fiddles and bagpipes filled the night air as villagers danced beneath the stars. They gathered around the hearth to swap stories, sing songs, and pass down oral traditions steeped in myth and memory. Faith too offered comfort. Though the church levied heavy tithes and enforced rigid discipline, it also provided a spiritual anchor. And most of all, they leaned on one another, families and neighbours, finding solace in solidarity when little else could be relied upon. Forging bonds of kinship and community, they sustained one another through the bleakest of times. Yet even the church, which promised salvation in the life beyond, could serve as a source of fear and repression in this one. In medieval Scotland, the Catholic Church stood as the most powerful institution beside the clans, extending its influence into every facet of daily life. From humble peasants to mighty nobles, all were expected to surrender a portion of their earnings to the church, sustaining the extravagant lifestyles of bishops and abbots, while their own kin often went hungry. The church held vast estates and exercised both secular and spiritual control over the people. But its strongest hold lay in the realm of morality and faith. The scriptures and papal decrees reigned supreme, and any deviation from accepted doctrine invited swift, often brutal consequences. Those accused of heresy or blasphemy faced ecclesiastical tribunals, where sentences ranged from imprisonment to torture, and sometimes execution by fire for their so-called transgressions. The Church's authority extended deep into personal matters. Marriage, considered a sacred rite, remained firmly under clerical control, and clergy could grant or deny their blessing at will. Divorce was virtually unheard of. Those who challenged the Church's teachings on chastity or sexuality faced the threat of public disgrace or excommunication. Still, the Church also served as a refuge and source of comfort for many Scots. The great abbeys and monastic communities scattered across the land provided education, charity, and shelter. Monks and nuns tended to the sick, fed the hungry, and opened their doors to the weary. Among the most revered figures of this era was St. Margaret, a devout English princess who rose to become Queen of Scotland in the 11th century. Known for her profound faith and kindness, Margaret endeavoured to reform the Scottish Church, aligning its practices with Roman customs and championing care for the poor and vulnerable. She founded hospitals, orphanages, and places of worship, labouring tirelessly to ease the burdens of her people. Her influence endured long beyond her lifetime, as generations of Scots sought her protection in their hour of need. Nevertheless, even Margaret's saintly influence could not dispel the darker aspects of the Church's dominion. As suspicion of heresy and witchcraft grew, the Church's role in persecution intensified. Witch trials became disturbingly common in 16th and 17th century Scotland. Those accused of consorting with dark forces were subjected to excruciating interrogations, often forced to confess under duress. Many met their fate at the stake, their cries echoing through the countryside as grim reminders of the price of straying from orthodoxy. Thus, the people of Scotland found themselves navigating between the rule of clan chieftains and the demands of religious leaders. Their daily existence was moulded by conflicting forces of loyalty and faith. They sought guidance and protection from those in power, but lived with the dread of divine punishment or earthly retaliation. It was a fragile equilibrium, one liable to collapse with the onset of conflict or a shift in fortune. And that balance would soon be put to the test. While clan rivalries and religious pressure weighed heavily on the nation, a looming danger gathered to the south. The English monarchy had long set its sights on Scotland, viewing it as a wild expanse rich in resources and ripe for domination. In 1296, Edward I of England, known as Longshanks for his imposing stature, launched a sweeping military campaign against Scotland, asserting his supposed claim to lordship over its crown. His armies surged across the border, laying waste to settlements and subduing resistance wherever it arose. Unprepared and vastly outnumbered, the Scots quickly succumbed. King John Balliol was captured and forced to relinquish his crown, which Edward claimed as spoils of war. Scotland fell under foreign control, its laws replaced by those of England and its people ruled by unfamiliar powers. Yet the spirit of the Scots remained unbroken. In the years that followed, a series of uprisings and revolts would soon shake the very foundations of English dominance, led by courageous and magnetic figures who would eventually pass into legend. One such figure was William Wallace, a modest knight hailing from Renfrew, who rose to command a guerrilla force that struck fear into English hearts. Though he came from unassuming beginnings, Wallace was fueled by an intense devotion to his homeland and a deep-seated resentment for the foreign oppressors. He managed to rally the Scots beneath his banner, orchestrating bold raids and surprise attacks on English outposts and supply routes. His most celebrated triumph occurred at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, where, against all odds, his numerically inferior troops trapped the English in a narrow crossing, leading to their mass slaughter. Wallace quickly became a beloved icon of Scottish resistance, an embodiment of defiance in the face of overwhelming adversity. However, his fortune waned. In 1298, a significantly larger English force defeated him at the Battle of Falkirk, dispersing his men and marring his reputation. For years afterward, he remained in hiding, continuing his guerrilla tactics while evading capture. But in 1305, his luck ran out. A Scottish noble betrayed him, delivering him into English hands. Transported to London in chains, Wallace was tried for treason and condemned to a brutal execution. On August 23rd, he was dragged on a hurdle through the streets, his body already ravaged by torture. At Smithfield, he suffered the full horrors of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. His severed head was later displayed on a spike atop London Bridge, a grim warning to those who dared challenge English authority. Yet Wallace's death did not extinguish his spirit. On the contrary, his martyrdom ignited a fresh wave of patriotic fervour, inspiring others to take up the fight. By 1314, at the Battle of Bannockburn, that inspiration bore fruit. Under the command of Robert the Bruce, who had claimed the Scottish crown in defiance of English rule, the Scots prepared to face an English army vastly superior in size and weaponry. However, they had a powerful asset, the schildtron, a dense circular formation of spearmen designed to withstand cavalry charges. As English forces charged with confidence, expecting a swift conquest, they collided with a wall of bristling spears poised for defence. the Chilterns absorbed the initial impact and launched a fierce counterattack. The clash of metal, the cries of the wounded, and the roar of defiance filled the air for hours. Ultimately, it was the Scots who stood victorious, their unity and bravery proving greater than the might of their foes. Bannockburn became a pivotal moment in Scotland's wars of independence, a signal that freedom was within reach. Still, the conflict would continue, and the road ahead remained steep. As the Stuart monarchs wrestled for control over rebellious nobles and restless clans, the everyday people of Scotland continued to suffer through hardships nearly beyond modern comprehension. Existence meant endless toil, not only resisting foreign threats or feuding neighbours, but grappling with the land itself. Scotland's harsh weather and unforgiving geography made agriculture a daunting task. The poor soil, often rocky and acidic, yielded minimal harvests, while the pervasive dampness chilled the labourers to their bones. From dawn until dusk, they worked the fields, sowing oats, barley, and peas in slender rows with basic wooden ploughs dragged by oxen. Cabbages and turnips filled out the small garden plots beside their homes. Yet a failed crop could bring starvation during the frigid winter months. To make matters worse, under feudal law, peasant farmers were required to give a significant portion of their produce to their landlords as rent. The nobility showed little restraint, extracting everything possible from their tenants and leaving families with barely enough to survive. In such a world, a man's value was not counted in coins, but in the cattle he owned and the strength he showed in battle. And even ordinary men, far from royal courts or major battlefields, lived in a constant state of vigilance. Cattle raids and clashes initiated by Highland clans were a regular threat. It was a world that forged tough individuals, where generational feuds persisted without resolution. Even familial bonds strained under the weight of relentless hardship. In such conditions, marriage often became a matter of practicality rather than romance. Their unions were often practical arrangements rather than matters of the heart. A bride might wear shoes only once in her life, typically on her wedding day, rough cowhide soles fashioned for the occasion. Children brought both joy and strain. They meant more mouths to feed, yet also more hands to gather peat from the bogs or work the fields. Sons were highly valued for their future role in defending the clan's name, while daughters were frequently married off as teenagers to strengthen familial bonds. The mourning cries of mothers echoed across the glens, for too many infants succumbed to cold, hunger, or disease. Yet despite the hardships they faced, the Scots held tightly to life, and to the customs that gave it meaning. The clans, so often locked in bloody conflict, were also the source of one's identity, one's roots in the world. Loyalty to kin was a kind of warmth, one that helped people endure even the harshest days. The Catholic Church, for all its control and fearsome dogma, also offered a measure of stability. Parish priests might thunder warnings of damnation from their pulpits, but they baptized newborns, solemnized marriages, and offered final rites to the dying. Abbeys and priories, scattered across the land, stood not only as centres of faith and learning, but also as places where even the lowliest serf could find a crust of bread or a roof for the night. Among these was Dunfermline Abbey, a sacred resting place of Scottish royalty and birthplace of a woman who would shape the soul of the nation, Queen Margaret. Born in exile, an English princess of devout faith and steely resolve, Margaret arrived in Scotland to wed King Malcolm III in 1070. Appalled by what she saw as a lax and unorthodox version of Christianity, she took it upon herself to reform the Church. With passionate devotion, Queen Margaret sought to align Scottish worship with Roman Catholic standards. She urged strict Sabbath observance and decried the casual ways of some priests who dared to drink ale even as they conducted Mass. More than a reformer, she was a benefactor. She promoted veneration of sacred relics and Latin liturgy over Gaelic traditions. And while she lived in luxury, Margaret exemplified charity. She financed a ferry across the Firth of Forth to aid pilgrims travelling to St. Andrew's Shrine, washed the feet of the poor, and gave generously to those in need, demonstrating a humility rare among the powerful. So forceful was her influence that she softened even the iron rule of Malcolm, who began to temper his governing with acts of compassion. Their union symbolised a fragile fusion between the Celtic and Anglo-Saxon royal lines, an attempt to knit together a fractured realm. Tragically, Margaret's life ended in sorrow. In 1093, grief-stricken by the news of Malcolm and their son's death in battle against the English, her own health gave way. As she lay dying, she held her treasured relics close, whispering prayers until her final breath. In time, she was canonized as St. Margaret. Though her years were few, her legacy was vast. She helped bring the Scottish Church into closer harmony with continental Europe and laid the foundation for stronger royal governance. But while queens and kings shaped policy, everyday life remained unchanged for most. The ordinary Scots whom Margaret had tried so dearly to uplift continued to till the land, bear their burdens, and hope for mercy. And in 1350, a new terror arrived, silent and unstoppable. It slipped ashore in merchant ships hidden among the rats and bales of cloth. The Black Death had reached Scotland. Like smoke over moor and mountain, it crept into ports and burghs, then fanned outward to the farthest glens. The plague, swift and merciless, showed no favouritism, cutting through hamlet and hall with equal devastation. Scottish chronicler John of Fordun recounted the grim scenes from that era. The widespread mortality began to spread through Scotland, claiming an enormous number of lives. So severe was the devastation that few dared to step outside, for the fear of infection was overwhelming. When the disease entered a home, it often claimed every soul within. No village or clan escaped the devastation. Entire households in some areas were extinguished, their corpses stacked in alleyways or buried hastily in communal graves. The afflicted were avoided, left to endure their final moments in isolation, as black buboes swelled beneath their arms and in their groins, and their skin turned blotchy and gangrenous. Widespread hysteria and fear overtook the land. Some levelled blame on the Jewish population, accusing them of poisoning wells, while others interpreted the plague as divine punishment for mankind's sins. Groups of flagellants wandered the countryside, lashing themselves in fervent attempts to atone for what they believed were collective transgressions. By the time the outbreak's deadliest wave receded, Scotland had lost nearly 1/3 of its people. Fields were left fallow, lacking the hands to tend them. Cattle roamed without herders, and goods remained unsold in deserted marketplaces. The country had suffered a grievous wound, one from which it would take generations to recover. Yet life pressed on. Those who remained buried their loved ones, patched together what fragments of family they had left, and resumed the slow work of rebuilding. They found resilience in the changing seasons, and leaned on the customs their ancestors had passed down. In the Highlands, clans continued the ancient tradition of seasonal cattle drives, moving their herds to higher pastures in summer, then guiding them back in autumn. The skirl of bagpipes echoed once more through the valleys, a solemn yet proud testament to a people who had endured. In the lowlands, the burghs gradually revived. Craftspeople and traders reopened their workshops and stalls. The great fairs that had once fueled the economy cautiously resumed, drawing merchants and customers from across the land. Trade in wool, hides, salt, and preserved fish resumed, weaving the nation's fragmented economic fabric back together. Still, looming challenges persisted. While Queen Margaret's reforms had drawn the Scottish Church closer to Roman orthodoxy, many clung tightly to older Celtic practices. The expanding authority of the Stuart monarchy deepened the cultural rift between the Gaelic-speaking north and the Scots-speaking south. Within the Highlands, clan chiefs governed their territories as though they were monarchs, meting out justice and commanding loyalty. Life for ordinary folk revolved around unending toil, sowing crops, tending livestock, and enduring the hardships of the land. Their homes were modest, roofed with thatch, and sparsely furnished, a reflection of their humble circumstances. Among them was Angus MacTavish, a tenant farmer on the lands controlled by Clan Campbell. From dawn to dusk, Angus laboured in the fields, his weathered hands gripping plough and scythe. Occasionally he would pause to brush the sweat from his brow, peering at the stone tower house of the Campbell chieftain in the distance, a constant symbol of the authority that ruled over him. His thoughts drifted to a recent raid by the MacDonalds. The chaos of that night remained vivid, cattle bellowing, swords clashing, the screams of men echoing through the darkness. Angus had survived, but his brother had not. Now rumours swirled of an impending retaliation. The clan was preparing to strike back. Angus felt an ache in his chest at the thought of yet more bloodshed. The pattern seemed unending. raids begot revenge, feuds persisted, and vendettas endured across generations. The Highlands were locked in this rhythm of violence, a harsh reality as permanent as the mist-veiled glens and jagged peaks. Even as the clans turned on one another, a greater menace brewed to the south. England's kings had long eyed Scotland's rugged lands with desire, seeking to draw the northern kingdom under their dominion. In 1296, Edward I, tall and iron-willed, earning the name Longshanks, launched a merciless invasion. His armies surged across the border, leaving a trail of ruin in their wake, razing towns and laying siege to a nation that refused to bend. Villages were laid to waste, their defenders mercilessly slain, yet the Scots, though heavily outnumbered and poorly equipped, refused to yield. They leveraged the rugged terrain, striking swiftly and vanishing into the glens, disrupting English supply lines with relentless raids. Among the most renowned of these freedom fighters was William Wallace, a lesser noble from Renfrew. Wallace bore a personal vendetta. His wife had been slain, and his village razed by English forces. Gathering a loyal band, he launched a campaign of bold, retaliatory strikes against the occupying troops. Wallace's most notable triumph occurred in 1297 at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. The English, confident in their might, attempted to cross a narrow bridge spanning the River Forth. Wallace, lying in wait, launched a sudden assault once half the enemy had crossed, effectively trapping and devastating the invaders. This resounding victory ignited the spirit of resistance across Scotland and struck terror into the English ranks. Yet Wallace's success was fleeting. In the following year, Edward I led a formidable force into Scotland, determined to crush the uprising. At the Battle of Falkirk, English longbowmen shattered the Scottish schiltrons, dense clusters of spearmen. Though Wallace evaded capture, his forces were dispersed, and the English tightened their hold on the realm. During the ensuing years, English dominance became increasingly suffocating. Nobles were coerced into swearing loyalty to Edward, while English officials governed the occupied regions. The common folk bore the brunt, their food stores and livestock requisitioned for English garrisons, their dwellings reduced to ash if suspected of harbouring rebels. Amidst this grim landscape, glimmers of hope remained. In monasteries scattered across the country, monks and nuns offered sanctuary, nursing the ill and comforting the broken. These spiritual havens served as both places of healing and quiet defiance. One enduring symbol of compassion was Margaret of Wessex, an English noblewoman who wed Malcolm III of Scotland in 1070. Despite her origins, Margaret became deeply devoted to her new homeland, working earnestly to uplift her people. Revered for her faith and generosity, she fed the hungry and championed the creation of schools and infirmaries. She played a pivotal role in revitalising the Scottish Church, which had grown negligent and morally lax. Margaret invited reform-minded English clergy to aid in spiritual renewal, encouraging the adoption of Roman rites and traditions. Her contributions forged a lasting bond between the Scottish Church and the papacy. Yet, as ecclesiastical authority expanded, so too did its capacity for control and condemnation. The medieval church swiftly denounced any deviation from accepted doctrine. Suspected heretics and alleged sorcerers were subjected to brutal inquisitions, their confessions wrung through torment. One of the era's most fervent persecutors was John Knox, a zealous preacher who condemned witchcraft with fiery passion. In 1563, he issued a scathing pamphlet titled The First Blast of the Trumpet against the monstrous regiment of women, arguing against female rulers, targeting Mary, Queen of Scots, whom he likened to a biblical villainess. Knox's incendiary words helped fan the flames of Scotland's witch hunts in the 16th and 17th centuries. Still, amid these grim spectacles, the people endured. They held fast to ancient lore, to the legends of gallant warriors and enchanted beasts. They found solace in the stark grandeur of their homeland, in the purple moors, in the swirling mist over the glens. Their resilience lay in a steadfast pride, a refusal to surrender their cultural soul to foreign dominion. It was this enduring fortitude that culminated in the Declaration of Arbroath in 3020, a powerful assertion of Scotland's sovereignty. As long as 100 of us remain alive, it boldly stated, we will never be subjected to English rule. For it is not glory nor wealth nor honours we fight for, but freedom alone, which no honest man gives up but with life itself. These stirring words would echo through history, inspiring generations of Scots to stand for liberty, even as the path to it remained long and fraught. And brutal though the path remained, marked by both sorrow and sacrifice, the people of Scotland never wavered in their pursuit of that noble dream. As the sun dipped behind the distant peaks, Angus MacTavish straightened from his labour, his back aching from the long day's exertion. Gazing over the fields, the landscape bathed in soft golden hues, he felt a deep and abiding love for his homeland. In spite of the hardships, war, hunger and illness, this enduring affection gave him strength to press on. It was a devotion he knew was not his alone, but one held by all Scots, from the humblest tenant to the highest laird. This bond, steadfast as the weathered stone of the ancient castles scattered across the hills, tethered them to their roots. With slow, tired steps, Angus began the trek toward his modest cottage. Though his body sagged with fatigue, within him a flicker of hope still glowed, a quiet flame that defied the darkest nights. He believed, as they all did, that no matter how bitter the winter, the spring would surely return, bringing with it renewal for both the land and its people. The saga of medieval Scotland remains one of blood, endurance and unwavering spirit. It tells of a nation's courage, forged through centuries of turmoil. And as they reflect upon those bygone eras, marvelling at the strength and steadfastness of their ancestors, they find both humility and inspiration. In the triumphs and tragedies of the past, there lies a mirror to their own hopes and hardships, a reminder of the powerful threads that connect them still. So let them remember the steadfast Scots who paved the way, let them honour their endurance and sacrifices, and let them aspire to uphold the legacy handed down through generations. For a nation is not defined solely by its grand fortresses or royal crowns, but by the dreams and determination of its people. As long as their hearts remain true, as long as their hopes continue to shine, Scotland will stand strong, a realm of stories and heroes, beauty and resilience for all time. As illustrated, the feuds among rival clans played a pivotal role in shaping the medieval Scottish experience. Among these conflicts, one stands out in both intensity and longevity, the bitter enmity between Clan Campbell and Clan MacDonald. The roots of this enduring hatred trace back to the early 1300s, when Robert the Bruce awarded the lordship of Lorne to his loyal Campbell allies. Yet this land had long been claimed by the MacDonalds, who viewed the Campbells as unwelcome usurpers. From this contested inheritance blossomed centuries of violence and vengeance. The feud reached a particularly grim height in 1646, with the massacre at Dunaverty. There, around 300 MacDonald men, women and children sought refuge within the walls of Dunaverty Castle, hoping for safety from the approaching Campbells, whose numbers far surpassed their own. The Campbells laid siege, unleashing relentless cannon fire upon the fortress. Eventually the MacDonalds, seeing no route of escape, surrendered, believing they would be taken as prisoners of war. But Captain Gillespie, the Campbell leader, had no intentions of mercy. In a cruel and calculated betrayal, Gillespie's men systematically executed those who had yielded, extinguishing lives that had already laid down their arms. Those who had surrendered, expecting mercy, were met instead with ruthless violence. Even innocent women and young ones fell beneath the blades of the Campbell warriors. When it ended, the mutilated bodies were thrown from the cliffs into the crashing sea, the tide washing away all trace, yet not the memory. The massacre would leave a lasting stain on the Campbell name, a bitter legacy remembered for generations. Still, despite the centuries of conflict, there were moments when the Campbells and MacDonalds stood on the same side, however uneasily. In the 1490s, during King James IV's campaign to bring order to the unruly Highlands, the lordship of the Isles, long held by the MacDonalds, was revoked. Surprisingly, it was the Campbell Earl of Argyll who advocated keeping the MacDonalds in place. It wasn't affection that motivated him, but a shrewd understanding that balance among the clans served his own interests best. Such were the shifting sands of Highland politics. Allies turned rivals, enemies became partners. Loyalty to one's clan was the only reliable constant in a world that often seemed to turn upside down overnight. This ever-changing web of alliances wasn't limited to the Highlands. Across Scotland, as tensions mounted between England and France, allegiances realigned on a national scale. The ancient Auld Alliance gave Scotland both a diplomatic lifeline and military support against England's aggressive advances. But that bond, too, changed with the political tide. Meanwhile, ordinary Highlanders lived beneath the daily threat of raids and revenge. The rugged terrain was scattered with weathered stone peel towers, ever on alert. These strongholds offered shelter when raiders swept in, burning, looting, and settling old scores. Clashes could erupt over the smallest slight, a trespass into another's grazing field, or an unresolved insult from generations past. Men tilled their fields with one hand on a plough and the other never far from a blade. A sword and dirk were never out of reach, and they stood ready to rally beneath the clan standard at a moment's notice. Women and children too learned to prepare for attack. A bag of oats, some dried fish, and the instinct to flee to the tower, these became second nature. Even in dreams they were attuned to danger, alert for the blare of the cow horn or the dreaded cry that summoned them to arms. Every Highlander was, in essence, a warrior. Their attire spoke volumes. A broadsword strapped to the waist, a round targ in hand, and a long dirk tucked beneath the belt. Wealthier clansmen might don a hauberk of chainmail, and during rare lulls in bloodshed, they channeled their prowess into friendly contests, stone-putting, caber-tossing, testing both strength and pride in times of peace. But this was no mere sport. In the Highlands, defeat in battle meant more than humiliation. It meant losing cattle, homes, loved ones. Defeated clans might be enslaved, left to starve, or vanish into obscurity. So, chiefs worked ceaselessly to secure their position. They forged bonds through marriage, through fosterage, and oaths sworn on sacred relics. They manoeuvred politically, seeking favour from the Lords of the Isles, the Earls of Mar, and the Royal Stewarts, when the Crown paid any mind to the Highlands at all. And yet through it all, the raids, betrayals, and constant turmoil, the Gaels of the Highlands maintained a rich and defiant culture. For them, the clan meant everything: identity, duty, and a shield in a land that offered little else. Life remained harsh and often short, but it pulsed with a wild communal energy, something that those of us today can scarcely imagine.